all of you. I think that as we are now at time of the start of our meeting, we can start it. As Caridad ask everybody, please keep yourself on mute and also your cameras off. That will help us to keep better technical conditions for this call. Also, of course, make much easier for everyone to listen and hear and also speak. So especially microphones need to be on mute. Welcome to the Sustainable Use for Post-2020 Global Biodiversity work. We have many participants out of over 400 registered. And this consultation through its entirety for the next 2 months will be chaired by 2 distinguished colleagues nominated by co-chairs of the open-ended working group on Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. I believe that many of you know those 2 great people very well. So one of them is Mphatso Martha Kalemba. She is Principal Environmental Officer at the Environmental Affairs Department in Malawi. She is SABSTA and ABS National Focal Point and also responsible for many other biodiversity activities. She has a degree in environmental governance and in environmental science and technology. Mphatso has various experience with the CBD, and you definitely know her from many of our meetings. She was also a member of the Global Youth Biodiversity Network and also IPES Fellow for the Africa Region Assessment. Colleagues, can I ask you to put your microphone on mute? That will help everybody. So Mphatso is a board member of the Wildlife Environment Society of Malawi and represented also Malawi in the interim core group of the African group of negotiators. And prior to Environmental Affairs Department, Mphatso worked as a scientific officer at the National Research Council of Malawi. And also I can invite all of you to follow her blog, Malawi Nature's Guard. So please do. And we also have the second colleague for this consultation. And again, many of you know him very well, Norbert Baerlocher. Norbert has a law degree from Freiburg State University, and for a few years was working in the law office and then joined the Foreign Service as attorney. Being at the Foreign Service, he had several assignments, representing in Mexico, in Indonesia, in Germany, and US. And also from birth, he was heading the desk for Eastern Europe and Central Asia. Since 2014, he joined the Federal Office for the Environment, where Norbert acts as head of the Rio Convention section, following all 3 conventions. He was deputy head of delegation for the negotiations of UNFCCC Paris Climate Agreement. Of course, many of us, we know Norbert as a very active member of biodiversity community. He also is a main focal point for the CBD and served as head of delegation at the last 3 conference of the parties to the CBD. He also represents the host country Switzerland in the Council of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, IUCN. So, colleagues, you can see that we are in a very capable, professional, and friendly hands of our 2 colleagues. And with that, I give floor and the rest of the meeting to them. Martha, Norbert, please go ahead.
Mphatso, you're muted. If you want to unmute yourself, please.
Okay. Good afternoon and good morning, colleagues. Thank you so much for the introduction that has just been given. And I would say we are so happy and grateful to have been given the opportunity to be co-leads under this important thematic discussion on sustainable use. So dear colleagues and dear participants, just a reminder that you should mute yourselves and as well turn off the camera so that we do not have the background noises and we can be able to hear the speakers as they speak. I'll just proceed. There is a lot of background noise. But however, I would like to formally open this webinar and this consultation to support the post-2020 process. And I also have the honor to introduce Ms. Elizabeth Maruma Mrema, who is the Executive Secretary of the Convention on Biological Diversity. So take this opportunity to congratulate you, Elizabeth, for your recent appointment. Your guidance and support in this process will be invaluable. So I'll give the floor to Elizabeth for opening remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and many thanks, and welcome also to all the participants, colleagues, friends, and this important meeting. Let me start by going to the opening of this webinar on thematical consultations on sustainable development on biological diversity for the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. I know we have quite an agenda, as my colleague Alexander had indicated, over 400 participants registered. Already I see over 100 online and many more still continue to join. Nonetheless, I would like to highlight three main points and purposes of our discussions. First, this is the first post-2020 thematic consultations being organized in this virtual modality. The unprecedented challenge of the global pandemic has forced us all to cancel or postpone a number of important physical meetings. We have learned many lessons during this difficult period, but also have built expertise in using Zoom and other multiple platforms to connect to each other, and this meeting is one of those. But another important lesson we've learned that it has become clear and louder that as science advances, that is also sustainable use of biodiversity that is a critical issue for protecting human health and well-being, and for long-term benefits, not only for humans, but our livelihood and also ecosystems and animal health. Second, sustainable use of biological diversity is one of the three objectives of the Convention. It is not only essential to the full functioning of ecosystems and survival of species, but it also benefits humankind, particularly those people who are directly dependent on biological resources for their livelihood, particularly the women, the youth, the poor, and those in vulnerable conditions. Of the Universal Sustainable Use Principles, among other steps, our convention has rightly framed sustainable use as a cross-cutting issue and as an effective tool to support poverty to achieve sustainable development. It's an important opportunity for us all to strengthen the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. I therefore invite each and every one of you to be constructive, to make your voices heard by ensuring that you are engaged in the rest of the activities planned as part of this consultation. But also We need to be ambitious and to aim for a transformative framework by ensuring that the sustainable use of biodiversity is enshrined as a tenet of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. The current unprecedented rates of biodiversity loss clearly require nothing less than a framework that can truly ensure the realization of our vision of living in harmony with nature. Only then, when biodiversity is widely used, restored, conserved, can we make this vision a reality. Last but not least, let me finish also by joining Alexander to thank our colleagues, Ms. Martha Kalemba, as well as Mr. Norbert Baerlocher, for their guidance and excellent support in organizing this consultation. I cannot, of course, forget our dear co-chairs of the Post-2020 Working Group, all of whom, as always, have steered us along the way. Permit me now to wish you all a productive session as we all look forward to seeing the results, not just of our consultations, but also the online survey and online forum going on. Thank you very much, and all the best.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for the opening remarks. And indeed, just to say that sustainable use is indeed one of the pillars of this convention, and cross-cutting, and an important tool to achieve sustainable development and living in harmony with nature. We will now proceed with a short presentation and myself as an introduction to this webinar and the entire consultation process to provide some context and background information. So I will start, and Norbert will come in just to continue with the components of the presentation. I will go to the background. The background and the context of the this consultation, just to recall.
Mphatso, you muted yourself.
Okay, just to give a background of this discussion that we are having today on sustainable use, you may recall that COP Decision 1434 set out the process for development of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, in which it outlined that the process should be comprehensive and participatory, but also it gave a go-ahead to have the open-ended working group, and Basil as well as Francis, Basil from Canada and Francis from Uganda, were appointed as co-chairs to oversee the process of the post-2020 framework. And further to that, we have had two open-ended working group meetings, and the first meeting also gave direction to allow the open-ended working group to implement a number of meetings and consultation workshops for the development of the post-2020 global framework. And the second meeting of the open-ended working group, which was recently in Rome, also provided a direction that we should have the thematic discussion on sustainable use to be undertaken in Bern from March 30th to 1st April. So in preparation for this, there were two webinars that were organized, and also a preparatory meeting that was conducted with some partners in February. Next. Now, because of the pandemic that we are all facing, COVID-19, we were not able to hold the meeting in Bern as earlier planned. So it had to be cancelled, and that's why we are here now, having this consultation meeting online. because we still want to ensure that we can generate further views for consideration on the elements that are relating to sustainable use of biological diversity for the post-2020 framework. So we are happy that we were considered and have been given the opportunities, me and Norbert, to co-lead this thematic discussion. Next slide. I'll just give an update on my next slide on upcoming events and meetings that have a bearing on how sustainable use and the outcomes of these consultations can contribute to those discussions. So the first upcoming meeting is the virtual preparatory meeting for SABSTA 24 and SBI, which is being planned online as well from 15 to 18 September. So the outcomes of this thematic consultation on sustainable use are also going to contribute to this discussion. We also have an upcoming meetings for SABSTA and SBI, which are being planned to happen in November physically. So we are hoping that if there are any changes, they will be communicated, but the outcomes of this thematic discussion also will be considered as information documents for those upcoming meetings. Then we have the open-ended working group meeting, the third meeting that is being planned for Cali, Colombia, where the report of the outcomes of this thematic discussion will also be considered. And finally, the outcomes of this thematic discussion will be discussed at COP15 in Kunming, China. And this slide is just giving, for your information, on the CBD website, you can find all information documents, as well as all the reports that will emanate from these thematic discussions will be available under the sustainable use window when you open on the CBD website. So this slide is just to indicate where exactly you can be able to view those documents and get information for reference for this thematic discussion. With that background context, I would just like to hand over to my colleague, Norbert, to be able to give us the objectives and also the goals of this thematic discussion so that we are all on the same page as we proceed. Over to you, Norbert.
Thank you very much, Mphatso. And hello to everybody. I am sitting in Bern, where the workshop should have taken place. Unfortunately, we could not meet physically because of the outbreak, as it has been said by Mphatso, and everyone is aware. We try to do our best, Mphatso and me, to have this workshop as good as possible, even if we face some technical glitches. But we're all in the same boat, and as I said, we do the best to have this fruitful exchange. Now, what is the objective of this workshop? You are aware that we only have 3 open-ended working groups, and therefore we decided that we will have specific workshops on
Norbert, you muted yourself.
That was the Holy Ghost, I guess. But thank you for telling me. I wasn't muted, but I did not touch any button, so this, I don't know how it happened. So I don't know where you heard me. I just wanted to say that the objective of this workshop is like the other ones. These are not negotiations, but it is a perfect occasion for a broad exchange. We had an open process, as we said. So we have more than 400 participants, NGO, state negotiation delegations, international organizations. And I'm sure that the main objective of this workshop is clear. We should discuss and see where we have convergence and where there are still different positions that we might then tackle in the negotiations. But also, and that's an important point that I'm always... We should... Somebody's muting me. We should try to see if we can have quite concrete proposal for the global biodiversity framework. As you are aware, the co-chairs, they will draft the first draft for the open-ended working group 3. So they are eager to get our input input to help them in their difficult task. And so our goal and ambition is also to help them by coming up with some concrete proposal. How could we integrate sustainable use in the global biodiversity framework? We will provide further insight and in this now in the first workshop some experts that will give us share with us their experience in their field, and we will see how interconnected that sustainable use of the biodiversity is with many other themes that we are dealing with in the biodiversity framework. We have concrete proposals on elements for goals, targets, and indicators and baselines. They're already here. We have drafts of text. So we also hope that in this workshop we can take them into account, and we can further develop these reflections, as I said, to help to prepare the next version of the draft text for the Global Biodiversity Framework. Next slide, please. As you know, that sustainable use is one of the main targets and goals of the CBD. We are since the beginning aware that we should and can not only conserve, but it is a fact that we also use biodiversity. Everybody, when we eat, we are normally reliant on biodiversity, what nature is producing for us. Our houses are built wood and so on. So it is clear that it is a very, very important and central piece of the biodiversity. So we have to make sure that this will be done in a sustainable use in the different areas of the global biodiversity framework. Some people, as it has been said, consider it therefore to be a cross-cutting. So whenever we are focusing on another issue, we always should bear in mind what can we add to make it more sustainable, the way we use what nature, Mother Nature. Next slide. As I said, we do not negotiate, but we should capture in a synthesis at the end our perspectives, where they are common, where they are still different. We should therefore not negotiate and strive for a consensus. If there is one, the better. If there is none, then we leave this up for the negotiation process. And as I had said before, our main goal is to inform the co-chairs on a concrete, constructive way forward for the next first draft of the Global Biodiversity Framework. It is a party-led process, which means that the parties will at the end negotiate. Here it's very open. It is meant to be like this, so that we can listen not only to the delegations, but also to all the NGOs that are joining us. And I heard that the majority of the participants are not party of the negotiation delegations, but they are NGO representatives. I think this is what I have to say, and we can hand over to Mphatso again, who will continue with the next segment of our presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Norbert. I'll now give an overview of the process that we have ahead of us in terms of this thematic discussion up to the end, when we'll have a document that we can submit to the open-ended working group 3. Next slide. So moving forward, for the process of the consultation on sustainable use, we are having this as our first meeting, which is the webinar, which will just introduce the process and the background of the consultation and give an overview of sustainable use as a concept. Then we'll move on to the online survey, which will immediately be circulated for your input and response. So we are hoping that all of you will be able to participate in the online survey and provide your inputs for a period of 3 weeks up to 17th August. After we have finished the online survey and has consolidated the outcomes, we'll go forward to have an online moderated forum, which will run from 7th to 11th September. So this will allow further discussion from the outcomes and the results of the survey, and will be open for a minimum of 5 days. So we'll have more discussion to look at the outcomes of the online survey. Then we'll have a second webinar in October. This will be in 2 time zones to allow that there is more participation and that we can accommodate the different time zones. And we'll present and discuss the outcomes of the survey as well as the outcomes of the online forum that will be moderated. And then we are expecting that we'll have a final report that will be ready to be submitted to SABSTA as an information note, but also a report that will be submitted to Open-Ended Working Group 3 for consideration. So this is the process that we'll undertake from now up to October. Next. On the next slide, we just like to recognize some of the partner organizations as well as panelists, some of who will also present today, who have contributed in organization of this thematic consumption, but also will provide input in terms of their expertise on the area of sustainable use. So we have IUCN, we have IPBES, we have FAO, we have CPW, we have Forest Peoples Program, NASCO, and Union of Ethical Biotrade, who are going to be presenters today, but also have contributed in the organization of this thematic discussion. Next slide. So this slide is just showing today's agenda, what we are going to go through by the end of the day. We are going to be, first of all, we've had the opening remarks and the introduction that we are doing now. And after that, we are going to have a series of presentations with breaks, 5-minute breaks in between. But we'll also have a question and answer discussion. When we go to that, we'll explain how that's going to be handled, considering that there is a large amount of people that are participating today. We may not be able to get all the questions, but we'll be able to select a few and to respond to them whilst keeping note of all the questions that will come through. So after the first set of presentations, which will be the concept, the background information, which will be provided by IUCN and IPBES, we'll have a question and answer discussion session and then a 5-minute break. Then we'll go to the next set where we'll also have another set of presentations focusing on sustainable use and sustainable wildlife management. And then we'll have a question and answer session as well. So between those, we'll be alternating, me and Norbert, in terms of coordinating those several sessions. And then we'll also have another set of presentations focusing on customary sustainable use, which will be followed by question and answer session and another break. Then finally, we'll have a presentation from the co-chairs of the Open-Ended Working Group, which will be followed by question and answer session as well, and then we'll wrap up the discussion. So this is today's agenda. I'll just hand over to Norbert to conclude our presentation and then give guidance in terms of how the webinar is going to be handled. Over to you, Norbert.
Thank you, Mphatso. So the last chapter of our introduction deals with the background documents and the materials and some technical instructions that you already heard, but I'm happy to repeat them because it's important that this works to facilitate our exchange. The next slide shows us the background documents that the Secretariat has prepared for this workshop and this series of exchanges in the forum and in the survey. First, we have 3 documents that are focusing on sustainable use and that have been prepared for this workshop. You'll find the links, and hopefully you have been on the homepage that has been shown on a slide. It's on the Global Biodiversity Framework homepage, where you have sustainable use as one of the thematic workshops, and there you will find all the documents that are mentioned here. Then we have also 2 documents on the list that are prepared for Substa 24. I know it's not that clear how we share the role between the open-ended working group and the Substa process, but in general, we know that Substa is focusing on scientific advice, also for the open-ended working group process, and therefore it isn't a kind of overlapping. We are playing a little bit of ping pong, discussing it in the open-ended working group in this workshop, handing it over to the Substa and SPI discussions, and then it comes back to the open-ended working group 3 in Cali. And for this Substa 24 in particular, of course, you are aware that there is this monitoring framework. It is still on for discussion, as we have been informed by the Secretariat. The delay has the date to hand it in has been prolonged, so we have still 2 weeks to work on it. If we didn't finish our work, our internal work coordination, together with this draft monitoring framework, we got a long list of indicators, and of course this is also relevant for us when we are discussing sustainable use. How can we measure the impact of sustainable use? We need some indicators and agree on that. So these are the documents, and then for the form, we have this concept note that explains you what it's all about, what we are doing right here. I think that's what I can say for the background documents. And I can finish with the last slide. Again, reminding you that you should, and I heard not much background noise right now, so that means that most of us have understood that unfortunately, video and microphone has to be muted so that we can concentrate and focus on those who have the floor. Otherwise, with, as I said, more than 400 participants, it would be impossible to manage and lead us through this workshop. So thank you for muting your microphone and your camera. And also thank you for using the chat function for your questions. We have always one eye that is following all the text that we get from the chat, so that you are aware what you have in mind, if there are problems or if there are in particular questions to the different presentations. As Mphatso has said, we will have always a Q&A session after 2 or 3 presentations in one session, and then we will have to pick. We cannot discuss all the questions that have been put forward, but a few of them, and the others will still be relevant for the final report, but not only. The experts are also ready to give written answers in the chat after this session, and we can also discuss it in the online forum. So be assured that your questions will really be answered, if not today, then during the process. So this is what I can say, and I will now hand over again to Mphatso, and we will really start with the content. Please, Mphatso.
Okay, thank you, Norbert, and thank you, participants. I hope this presentation has helped to set the context and provided an overview of the process for the consultation. We'll be taking questions, like Norbert has said, after our next panelist. So I would like to introduce our speakers for this session. First, we have Ms. Dilys Roy. She is chair of the Sustainable Use and Livelihoods Specialist Group of the International Union of Conservation of Nature, IUCN. She will be followed by Ms. Marla Emery and Mr. John Donaldson, who are chairs of the Sustainable Use of Wild Species Assessment, which currently is underway as one of the assessments run by the IPBES. So I'll hand over to these presenters, and then we'll come back to get the question and answer session. Over to you, Dilys, first, and then Mara and John.
Thanks very much, Mphatso, and thank you for inviting me to speak at this important consultation. So I'm just going to talk about some of the background concepts to really clarify what sustainable use means and what different perceptions there are of sustainable use, just so that we can ensure that everybody is understanding that there are these sort of different perspectives on it, and we might all be talking a little bit at cross purposes sometimes when we talk about sustainable use, because different people have different understandings. Next slide, please. So as has already been pointed out, sustainable use is one of the 3 foundational pillars of the CBD, alongside conservation and equitable benefit sharing. Next slide. The CBD defines sustainable use as a sort of desired end state. So it talks about the way that biological diversity is used and the rate at which it's used, with the important thing being that it doesn't lead to a long-term decline of biological diversity, and therefore it maintains its potential. And in detail, Article 10 of the CBD, which talks about sustainable use, puts the obligations on parties to the CBD to make sure that it's integrated into decision-making, to make sure that use doesn't have, or at least minimizes, adverse impacts on biodiversity. It recognises the importance of customary sustainable use and calls on parties to protect that. It notes the need to support action to remediate degraded areas, and it talks about the need to cooperate with the private sector to develop methods for sustainable use. Next slide, please. The CBD produced some guidelines on sustainable use back in 2004, and the Addis Ababa Principles and Guidelines set out 14 practical principles and associated operational guidelines. And they really emphasize the fact that, as well as being a desirable end state, sustainable use is an important tool, both for conservation and for local economic benefits, culture, and other social benefits. So it's both a tool for conservation and for human well-being. Next slide, please. Sustainable use is not just mentioned in the context of the CBD, but it's also important to the other biodiversity conventions. I'm not going to read out all of these definitions or decisions that have been made about sustainable use, but important to note that it's highlighted in CITES, in CMS, and in Ramsar, as well as in the CBD. Next slide, please. And also in IUCN, my organisation, which produced a policy statement that was adopted in 2000, which again talks about the importance of sustainable use as a conservation tool, and as a conservation tool because of the social and economic benefit that it delivers to people. Next slide, please. So as I said at the beginning, there are different perceptions of sustainable use, and I think that these are sort of evident in the definitions and the descriptions of it. So the CBD definition presents sustainable use as this dynamic process towards a desirable end state. So using biodiversity at a particular rate so that it doesn't undermine its ability to renew itself, and it's always there for future generations. But the Addis Ababa Principles and Guidelines and some of our other definitions really focus on the importance of sustainable use as a tool. So not so much the end state, but the tool for conservation and the tool for human benefit. And it's important to notice that these tools don't have to be, you don't have to decide that you support sustainable use as one or the other. The CBD Resolution 712 talks about sustainable use being both a tool for conservation of biodiversity and a tool for poverty alleviation, and therefore the achievement of sustainable development. But it's also important to note that these perceptions of sustainable use are also not interchangeable. Some people only think of it as a desirable end state, some people only think of it as a tool for conservation, and some people only think of it as a tool for human benefit. So it's really important when we're discussing sustainable use to be clear what particular standpoint different advocates are coming from. Next slide, please. Particularly in my line of work, we talk about sustainable use mainly in the context of wildlife, but it equally applies to agriculture, fisheries, forestry, and other natural resource sectors. So important to note that it's not just about wildlife. Next slide, please. And it can involve a huge, wide range of practices. So all sorts of things from hunting and trapping of animals, collecting and gathering plants and fungi, logging, harvesting non-timber forest products, fishing, sort of viewing experiences for culture or recreational reasons or other spiritual experiences, cultivation and so on. The list is endless of the different types of practices and activities that can be involved in sustainable use. Next slide, please. I think it's important to note that it can have different purposes. So people might practice sustainable use for subsistence reasons, to meet subsistence needs, for commercial practices, or for recreational, spiritual, and cultural purposes. Next slide, please. And it can be carried out or driven by very different stakeholders. So it sometimes might be something that's driven or encouraged by governments, by the private sector, or by indigenous and local communities. Next slide, please. And it can be consumptive or it can be non-consumptive. And within consumptive use, it might be lethal and involve killing of animals, or it might be non-lethal extraction. And even where we talk about non-consumptive use, it's important to realize that lots of uses that might not be consumptive on the target species or target resource might still have some other environmental impact, so might not be non-consumptive at all. So tourism, for example, is often described as a non-consumptive use. It's non-consumptive in that it doesn't kill the wildlife that's being watched, but it does extract water and it does have other impacts. So there's a real blurring between these definitions of different types of use, particularly when we get to this issue about consumptive and non-consumptive use. And this issue about consumptive and non-consumptive use is often where quite a lot of the controversy about sustainable use lies. Quite often, people that will think about sustainable use as only being about consumptive use, particularly of wildlife, and see that if people are pro-sustainable use, it must mean that that's what they support. They support consumptive use of wildlife, not recognizing that there are these many, many other forms of sustainable use. Next slide, please. So just thinking a bit more about what it means to be for sustainable use, pro-sustainable use. Again, it depends on whether you see it as being this desirable end state or being a tool for different types of purposes. So one position that people might have is that they are pro ensuring that all use is sustainable. That's what they're for, and so therefore they're against unsustainable use. Another position might be that you support sustainable use if it benefits conservation. And some people might only support non-consumptive use, not all sustainable use, but you support some form of use if it benefits conservation. And those benefits might be because it generates socioeconomic incentives and that provides a conservation incentive for local people. All those benefits might be that some form of use, whether it's some kind of population management, harvesting of pest species, for example, provides wider conservation benefits. So in that position, you'd support use if it's sustainable, where it benefits conservation, and you're probably a sort of less supportive of really strict, no-use, strict conservation measures. And then a third position is that you would support sustainable use. And again, maybe you have a caveat in about only non-consumptive, but you might support sustainable use if it benefits humans, even if there's no direct conservation benefit. So again, you're for sustainable use where it benefits humans, and you're against, the principle of no use or less use. And then a fourth position might be that you support all use, and you just think use is good regardless of whatever impacts that it has. And I think it's really important that we're aware of these different positions and that people might adopt different positions at different times. They might be used to make different arguments, but they are very different. They're looking at sustainable use from very different angles. Next slide, please. Within the post-2020 global biodiversity framework, we can see a number of these different positions in some of the targets. So for example, target 4, by 2030, ensure that harvesting, trade and use of wild species of fauna and flora is legal at sustainable levels and safe, reflects this position that all use should be sustainable and that we should prevent unsustainable use. Target 3 talks about ensuring active management actions to enable wild species of fauna and flora recovery and conservation. And of course, some of those active management actions might be sustainable use activities. So this target is reflecting that position of supporting sustainable use if it is a conservation tool. And then target 8, which talks about ensuring benefits for people through sustainable management of wild species of fauna and flora. This is reflecting that position of supporting sustainable use as a human development tool. Now, this is just cherry picking a few of the targets that are in the framework, not all of them, and others make reference to sustainable use as well. But I'm just using this to illustrate that even within this one framework, these different positions and different perspectives on sustainable use come out very strongly. Next slide, please. So just to sum up, it's a reminder that sustainable use is absolutely fundamental to the Convention on Biological Diversity, but it is a divisive subject and quite often a poorly understood subject where we might be arguing with people from very different starting points. There are multiple uses, there are multiple motivations, there are multiple drivers and multiple impacts, both direct and indirect. A final point that I've not covered in my slides is that it can actually, sustainability can actually be very difficult to measure in practice because there are so many different dimensions to it and because you have to be future looking, and it's hard to determine what level of use can actually ensure ongoing availability of those resources into the future. And it's also quite hard not just to measure in practice, but to conceptualize in theory in terms of what we should actually be thinking about when we're trying to think about what does sustainability means. So conventional definitions of sustainability focus on the triple bottom line of ecological, social, and economic sustainability. But in this current context of COVID-19, should we also be now refining our views about what is sustainable by taking into consideration disease risk, pandemic risk, and human and planetary health? And should we also be taking into consideration animal welfare concerns that can also affect some of these other issues around disease and health? So it's a complex subject, and we might need to sort of think about how do we actually define this and what actually counts towards sustainability, and has that changed from when we first defined it back in the 1980s in the Brundtland report? That's everything from me. I hope that provides a sort of a basic set of key concepts and clarifies these very different understandings of sustainable use and these different positions and how they've been reflected in the framework. Next slide. Thank you very much. And if anybody would like sort of more detailed background information on these concepts, you can visit our website. The web address is there, and there's some interesting discussion papers that describe some of these issues. Many thanks.
Okay, thank you so much, Dilys. This was a very informative presentation and serves as an excellent introduction to the complex concept of sustainable use that we are discussing today. Just to remind the next presenters that you have 10 minutes, let's try to keep to time. And also to the participants, if you have any questions, please indicate in the chat who you are directing your question to, and also just say your name and maybe your organization or the country where you're coming from as you type in your question, so that we are clear it's from whom and to who it's directed to. So now, dear Maria and John, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Mphatso, for that very kind introduction, and Dilys for that wonderful setup for the day and for our presentation. And our thanks to the CBD Secretariat for the invitation to speak with you today about the IPBES assessment of sustainable use of wild species in the context of the post-2020 targets. I am Marla Emery, and I'm joined by my colleague John Donaldson, together with our colleague Jean-Marc Fromentin, who could not be here with us today. We are the co-chairs of the IPBES assessment of sustainable use of wild species. John and I are going to try to give this presentation together. That may be a bit of a test of the WebEx technical capacity, and so we'll see how that goes. May we have the next slide, please?
Morning or afternoon, everybody. Thanks for the introduction, Marla. So what we're going to try over the next 10 minutes is to give you a little bit of background to the assessment, very briefly, just the scope and time frame, more completely the approach that we've taken, and then focusing on the relevance of what we're doing to the post-2020 targets and indicators. Just one caveat is that IPBES protocols don't allow us to divulge any of the findings or the outcomes. So this unfortunately has to be quite high level. And I think one of the things we're going to have to engage with CBD on is quite how we learn from the IPBES process without giving away the findings that we're not allowed to divulge. Thanks. Next slide, please.
So turning to the scope and the time frame of the assessment, next slide, please. The scoping document of the Sustainable Use of Wild Species Assessment charges it to identify approaches to enhance sustainable uses of wild species. And this is somewhat in contrast to previous IPBES assessments that have emphasized risks to and loss of biodiversity. Rather, the Sustainable Use of Wild Species Assessment is tasked with examining extractive and non-extractive uses. You will note that we've somewhat altered the language of consumptive and non-consumptive uses here, and to recognize the inseparable unity of nature and humanity throughout the analysis. The assessment has 6 chapters, which probe key concepts necessary to understand and operationalize pathways for sustainable use of wild species. And as Dilys has so cogently pointed out, that's not an easy task. Current status and trends in sustainable use, drivers of sustainable use, scenarios for future sustainable use, and current and potential policy options and responses that support sustainable uses of wild species. Next slide, please.
Yeah, we don't want to dwell on this slide too much because this is time frame, but I think the important point, there are 2 important dates in there. The first one is that the final document only goes to the IPBES plenary early in 2022, and that's why I say, unfortunately, quite a bit of this might not be able to inform the post-2020 targets directly. But we do have a second order draft coming out probably in early 2021, and that will also be accompanied by the first draft summary for policymakers. So those are just 2 important dates to bear in mind. Next slide, please. So we just want to talk to you a little bit about the approach. And next slide, please.
So we are taking a social ecological systems approach to sustainable use of wild species, and that necessarily then requires a multidisciplinary team working closely together. So the co-chairs are John, who is an expert in plant and animal trade. Myself, I am a geographer of the social science variety with over 20 years of experience working with Indigenous peoples and local communities on the roles of forests and their lives and livelihoods. And Jean-Marc is a marine biologist with decades of experience working on global fisheries governance. We're joined by 75 experts from 38 countries, 46 of whom are natural scientists, 20 are social scientists, and 9 are interdisciplinary scientists. And they include specialists in taxa, diverse taxa. As Dilys mentioned, often wildlife is the primary focus. The sustainable use of wild species is actually focused across taxa to include animals, fungi, and plants. And we are making use of diverse knowledge sources, including systematic reviews of the scientific literature, both peer-reviewed and gray, and Indigenous and local knowledge. If we could have the next slide, please.
So the framework that we're using, and there's quite a few speakers, and anyone who's worked in the system knows that we're dealing with complex socio-ecological systems. So the middle block is the way we're conceptualizing the whole sustainable use. It's an interaction between wild species, the practices that are used to interact with wild species, and then the uses that they get subjected to. All three of those components are subject to environmental and social drivers. So we need to understand what's driving change and how that whole system is then affected in terms of an outcome of sustainable use. Also acknowledging that the management policies and governance systems can affect the resource, they can affect practices, and they can affect need, demand, and trade. And it should in fact be interactive across all three of those. Next slide, please.
So here we have another graphic representation of that social ecological system of sustainable or not wild species uses. And we can see the variety of taxa that the sustainable use of wild species assessment is considering and the biomes and realms within which those occur. And that we are examining non-extractive and extractive practices, and quite a detailed breakdown of the kinds of uses to which wild species are put, recognizing that these uses all occur within multiple contexts, but in particular, governance, economy, culture, and technology. Next slide, please.
So you can go to the next slide, please. We just want to highlight some of the issues that are probably of relevance to the post-2020 targets. So the one issue that we've been grappling with, and which I see in quite a few of the comments on the draft targets and indicators, is even just defining wild species. In our view, that's dependent on the context, the purpose, the worldview, and we've been guided by the fact that it recognizes the co-production of nature. Next slide, next push down, please. So we've been looking at three axes of human interventions: intervention in survival productivity on the one axis, intervention in human-mediated distribution, and genetic selection of traits. And if you just look at a very broad definition, you can say that wild is in its original habitat with low genetic selection and little distribution, and domesticated at opposite extreme. But in fact, next slide, please. That space in between is not empty, and there are a whole lot of other types of populations which could be regarded as wild, depending on how broad or narrow your definition is. Next slide, please. So it can be very narrow. Next slide, please. Or it can be much broader. And for ours, we've mainly focused on populations that are in the original habitat and that are wild managed, although we do acknowledge that introduced populations and even captive populations can be important components of sustainable use. Next slide, please.
So as Dilys has suggested and is widely discussed and going on right now in the chat, defining the parameters of what constitutes sustainable use is another foundational challenge for the assessment, as well as for all of us working on this. Neither the social nor the ecological components of these systems are static, and both are multifaceted. And so any definition of sustainable use must accommodate this dynamic and complex character. But at the same time, it must support development of operationalizable goals and targets. In the assessment, we understand that the sustainable use over time, that to be sustainable use over time, wild species uses must yield good outcomes in both the social and ecological aspects of the equation. And given the dynamic quality of life on this planet, sustainable uses of wild species also include the capacity to monitor and adapt to changes in factors such as climate and social actors, to name just two of many. This necessarily involves indicators and metrics of both social and ecological well-being. A key challenge for both the sustainable use of wild species assessment and the post-2020 targets is to identify such broad, operationalizable categories of social and ecological indicators that can both be scaled up to national and international levels and scaled down to individual local cases. Also, central to this challenge is development of indicators and metrics for assessing them, which integrate the best available science and indigenous and local knowledge. Next slide, please.
So I think a key element of our assessment, which will certainly inform the CBD process going forward, is the status and trends. So that will allow us to build on other assessments, such as the state of the world's forests and state of the world's fisheries, but also to assess the actual trends in sustainable use itself and what the value is of various indicators. And that will help inform baselines, at least for post-2020 targets. Another key contribution is looking at drivers and scenarios. And this is certainly if we want to use the post-2020 targets to drive transformative change. We need to understand what the leverage points are and the pathways that are likely to drive a transformative change. So those are two key contributions that we see coming out of the IPBES assessment. Next slide.
As with indicators, policy options and responses must consider both social and ecological well-being. And indeed, one of the key messages to come out of the first and second ILK dialogue workshops for the assessment is that any approach that chooses one over the other is both ethically suspect and ultimately materially untenable. In addition to the tragic outcomes we're all aware of, there also are sustainable uses of wild species by people around the globe today, many of them with long histories. And these examples offer clues as to the characteristics of sustainable use and policy options and responses that can support them. However, many, if not most, are highly adapted to the local conditions in which they function, and so scaling up the lessons from them is a key challenge.
And probably the last challenge we're going to mention is that recognizing that policy options and responses operate at and across different scales. So their effectiveness is determined by a combination of factors, all of which must be taken into consideration. So like the post-2020 process, the key challenge for the IPBES assessment is identifying what is required to transition towards a just and sustainable use of wild species. And I think the final slide is just a thank you for listening to us.
Okay, thank you, Mara and John. There is no doubt that the IPBES assessment will help us a lot to think how to further refine and reflect all those issues in the post-2020 framework process. So thank you so much. We'll now move into the first question and answer session. I've noted on the chat that most of the comments that are there is just a discussion. So we haven't had very specific questions that are going to the presenters. I only managed to pick 2 questions, and I'll start with the first one, where it's going to Mara and John of when is the assessment going to be published? So there is a question asking about the date and when people should expect the publication of the assessment. So if you could take that, and then I'll have another question that is going to Delise. So Amara or John, can you please just respond to the first question?
Yes, thank you so much for that question. The assessment will go to the next IPBES plenary scheduled for sometime around March of 2022. And then there is always just a short delay after a plenary before full publication.
Okay, thank you for the response. And for Delise, there's a question that I've picked from the chat. Is there a problem with having different understanding of sustainable use as long as it is well incorporated within the target? So that's the question that I've picked for Delise. Could you please respond? It's already in the chat, and I've seen there have been some comments already, but maybe you can just explain further.
Delise, if you're speaking, we can't hear you.
Sorry. Yeah, no, I don't think it's a problem. I think what is a problem is if these different understandings of sustainable use and different perceptions are not recognized, and that we may end up speaking at cross purposes, because when one person talks about sustainable use, they mean something very different from what another person might be talking about. So I think it's great that the post-2020 framework actually does very clearly have targets that respond to these very different perceptions, and it has targets around preventing unsustainable use and tackling, illegal unsustainable use. It has targets around using sustainable use as a proactive conservation management action, and it has targets around ensuring local benefits or socioeconomic benefits from sustainable use. So I think it adequately covers these different perceptions. But it'd be interesting when we get to the indicators to then see how we can actually measure those different approaches.
Okay. Thank you so much, Delis. I think with those few two questions that have been well responded to, I know that the discussion is still going on in the chat, and I encourage the participants to please use the chat and continue the conversation. We'll move to the next session, and maybe we could go into a 5-minute break. I know we are behind time, so we'll just have a 5-minute break. Then after that, we'll go into the next session, and Norbert will take over from me. So we'll resume after 5 minutes, and hope to see you back. And let's continue the discussion in the chat. And if there are further questions, please indicate who you're asking and probably maybe who you are, so that we can have the conversation going. Thank you. So we'll meet you after 5 minutes.
Zo, met de start. Hello and thank you everybody. I hope you had time enough to get the coffee or any other things you had to do. We want to continue as we are a little bit behind the schedule. And we are moving now to the next segment of our workshop. This segment will have two experts discussing with us or presenting their views on two different topics. The first speaker and expert is Mr. Kim Friedman, who is a senior fishery resource officer at FAO in Rome. Dear Kim, the virtual floor is yours. Thank you for your presentation.
Thank you, Norbert, and all the organizers for arranging this day. Hopefully you can hear me. The chat really took off during that little break. It was getting very interesting. This talk presents a little about the lens through which FAO members see the world when considering approaches to improving people's relationship with nature in order to deliver on the aims of food security, vibrant communities with sustainable livelihoods, and biodiverse, resilient, and protective ecosystems. Next slide, please. Let's step back and examine how we view nature relative to our situation today. If you could advance, please. Historically, we thought of nature being about attaining balance and stability through progression to a climax biological community. Whereas today we've heard we work within a paradigm that recognizes far greater complexity and dynamism. Think of Marla Emery's talk that we just listened to. Our workspace is therefore much more in a socio-ecological systems rather than a biological or economic approach in separation. Such an approach results in a less fragmentation of work and greater clarity of biodiversity's relevance to people across everyone's vision for people and the environment. Next slide. Nature needs to be considered relative to our world situation, a situation that is always evolving through time. When Apollo 11 landed on the moon, the global population was half of what it is now. And it is thought to increase by as much as 50% again by 2050. Note also in this graph the rapidly growing buying power of the global community. So more people wanting and doing more. These factors are important as they provide the context of the various approaches we need to take in delivery of food production and of conservation. Next slide. The way we've thought about nature conservation has traditionally placed priority on exclusionary, in other words, avoid approaches for reversing biodiversity decline. The majority of land and seas outside of protected areas are suggested by the term protected areas as being not protected, or the corollary of making space for nature. Yet we know successful biodiversity conservation activities are present outside of national parks. The presence of other effective area-based conservation measures in the CBD Aichi Target 11, also proposed for the post-2020 framework, opens the door to a much broader range of actors being recognized in biodiversity conservation activities, many of which have been largely disenfranchised from conservation-based frameworks when asked to participate through protected area designations alone. If you could advance. We now need to shift effort up the mitigation pyramid from an over-reliance on avoidance strategies to strategies of minimization, rectifying, remediating strategies, as this is where the bulk of the people are and the nature interactions occur. Remember, billions of people draw their food or livelihoods either partially or fully from agriculture, forests, and fisheries. We need to work in concert to engage this community, educate this community, encourage this community, and empower this broad range of people to become participants in the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. Next slide. We are moving to act in more integral spaces or more integrated spaces, as we've heard through a number of the talks today, not just on single pillars of the triple bottom line, but across their interconnectedness. We can no longer rely on an ecocentric or an anthropocentric view of our vision of the future. If you could advance. To explore this further, I recommend a really useful paper by Belinda Reyes and Elizabeth Selly that concentrates the mind on what is possible in the post-2020 global biodiversity framework, bringing together fragmented components and recognizing feedback amongst them in order to create positive change for people and nature. Slide 6. This talk and this day is a conversation about biodiversity use, and we need to remember why we are mired in certain ways of thinking, reminding ourselves that unsustainable use is a major driver of biodiversity loss. Why is sustainable use so important for the delivery of outcomes in the post-2020? Advance. Point 1. Sustainable use relies on biodiverse, functioning, resilient systems. Point 2, that's an advance. National parks at any level of coverage won't support people in these types of places. Management will, and we have to remember that productivity hotspots are generally also use hotspots, and we need to get into those hotspots and work there. Point 3, advance. Users and markets need to be engaged and incentivized into joining the post-2020 conversation on maintaining and improving biodiversity and ecosystem functions. And point 4, this wish for action needs investment. Investment that will only flow if it's embraced by our leaders. And that means putting these things up in lights in frameworks like we're putting together at the moment. For ending, we need to focus on sustainable use to help counter negative impact from unsustainable use. Slide, please. I'm going to finish off with 4 key messages. This is message 1. Both wild and domesticated biodiversity need management, and they need it in a complementary way because they often occur on the same space, yet have different management approaches and stakeholders, all of which have very important parts of maintaining a biodiverse, functioning world that we live in. In both cases, this needs to take place at all levels. This needs to be better reflected in the framework, be it genetic, species, ecosystem levels. But a genetic level is particularly important in the domesticated biodiversity. How do we make this happen? How do we drive top-down and bottom-up action across the whole value chain? Next slide. Point 2, there's a lot of policy work already in place. It doesn't need to be restarted. It just needs strengthening in practice. Think of the ecosystem approach to fisheries and aquaculture, the multiple sustainable management practices for crops and livestock, such as agroecology, agroforestry, and many more. We need to leverage the full range of options open to the framework. An example of such a limit in the current draft is seen in Target 9, where there's over-reliance on conservation agriculture alone as an example. So keep in mind that not all human impacts on biodiversity are negative. As shown by the many concrete examples in the 2020 edition of the State of the World's Forest, jointly published by FAO and UNEP, and other FAO flagship publications such as the State of the World's Fisheries and Aquaculture. There are a lot of good news stories in these publications. Point 3, we need to strengthen guidance we already have and use existing indicators. Build on initiatives and solutions already in place, be they ecosystem approach, integrated approaches, sustainable soil management approaches. FAO is the custodian for 21 SDGs and is a contribute agent to another 5. Beyond the SDG indicators for which FAO is a custodian, FAO is monitoring among other things, input use, such as pesticides and fertilizer use, that could be integrated into the monitoring framework. They're not at the moment. Instead of developing new and costly indicators, it's going to take time to communicate and deliver. Taking lessons learned from previous experience without necessarily looking for innovation that requires a long lead-in process to get global momentum is a useful approach. And finally, my final message, message 4. Uptake and use of tools and solutions for implementation and mainstreaming are crucially important for enabling sustainable use. Awareness raising and knowledge transfer will only be delivered broadly if there's capacity support for the different stakeholders. And this need is going to be ongoing. We need to assist those that want to implement positive change in taking theory and policy into their daily practice, and in measuring the effectiveness of change using multiple indicators through time. This need will be ongoing for the next 10 years, and we need to keep the conversation alive over the next 10 years and encourage harmonization around successful strategies through thematic support groups linked to the post-2020 framework. We need to make sure that this is not an empty house, a paper framework. Sorry, can someone turn off their mic, please? Funded leadership around key themes at the CBD Secretariat and support nodes embedded in implementing agencies, similar to what we had in the custodianship of the SDGs, offers the foundations for greater ongoing engagement. So what support mechanisms are we going to enable for the next 10 years of work ahead of us? And I guess this message for is, let's fill the post-2020 house with all those reliant on biodiversity and support them on our journey. Let's not build an empty house. Next slide. Thank you. I'll just put some contacts here. If anyone wants to follow up, a few email addresses, we can send them copies of what they need from FAO. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kim, for this concise but excellent presentation on how the various agricultural sectors play an important role for the sustainable use of biodiversity, or can we say it also in the other way around, how biodiversity plays an essential role for agriculture and in all the different sectors. Also thank you for showing us that we still live in kind of silos. So in FAO, you know a lot of how to produce food, but you integrate more and more also sustainability in your programs. And I think CBD knew a lot about protected areas and how to make the conservation happen. But we have more and more also to open our minds and to integrate the fact that we all depend on biodiversity, and therefore we also should use it, but in a sustainable way, of course. Now, we have seen some questions, and I have noticed that it is a very good way to help us in our role to moderate this discussion by putting a cue at the beginning of your chat. That helps us to see that this is a question that you would like to ask to the experts. If you just want to add a comment or participate in the chat discussion, no problem, you can do this. But please help us by starting your intervention by a cue. Then you formulate the question, and at the end, you say to whom it is addressed and who you are, so that we can identify yourself. We will continue with, before we go to the Q&A, with the second presentation in this segment. And I will now introduce Christina Rodina. She is the Secretary of the Collaborative Partnership on Wildlife Management. I hope that you are aware that this partnership has members that are international organizations, has also members that are NGOs. And as the title says, they are focusing on how can we manage wildlife in a sustainable way. Christina, please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Norbert. Can you hear me well? Yeah, super. Thank you very much for the great introduction, and it's a great honor to deliver this presentation today on behalf of 14 partners of the Collaborative Partnership on Sustainable Wildlife Management. So I will call it CPW. This is the short name of the partnership. And first of all, also thank you to all partners for trusting the Secretariat with this assignment. And of course, thank you very much for CBD Secretariat and the open-ended working group under the great leadership of its two co-chairs in organizing this important webinar. So next slide, please. Let me start by very briefly walking through the main activities CPW has undertaken over the past year. So this activity is related to understanding how sustainable wildlife management can be integrated in the post-2020 framework. Firstly, in June last year, we organized a consultative workshop on the sustainable wildlife management beyond 2020 in Cambridge. I think the link will be posted now in chat box. The report of this workshop was brought to the attention of the 18th meeting of Science COP, as well as to the first meeting of the CBD open-ended working group on the post-2020. Later in November 2019, the CPW Secretariat delivered a keynote presentation on the role sustainable use and management of wildlife can play in biodiversity conservation at Substem. And then in this year, given the situation we're living in, we organized together with other key organizations a virtual workshop in March, where we discussed the suite of targets and indicators of the zero draft that were relevant to sustainable harvest, use, and trade in wildlife. Next one, please. When it comes to sustainable use and the post-2020, we noted that the targets of relevance to sustainable use, as they identified in the concept note, these are targets 4, 8, 9, 10, 13, and 15. But at the same time, the partnership also noticed that there is other targets that already other previous speaker reflected related to sustainable use of wildlife. For example, this is target 3 and target 14. And this brief presentation will be structured around targets 3, 4, 8, and briefly touching on 13, 14, 15. And we'll give you some examples of initiatives that partners are currently involved in. Next slide, please. So regarding target 4, first of all, there are 3 key elements related to sustainable use and trade that could be integrated as a basic principles of building these targets. So these are sustainability, legality, and traceability. So when we talk about traceability, we can also link this to the issue of safe harvest and trade. A particular attention given to harvest, trade, and use in this target is very welcome, but the partnership also thinks that it's the more clear definition of each term is really necessary in order to develop the appropriate indicators. In relation to scale, we thought that we need to look at the different uses such as subsistence or commercial, as well as focus on domestic and international trade. When it comes to monitoring elements, the monitoring elements, they should be inclusive of all taxa and habitats, as well as look at the different ownership types. And finally, we also thought the elements of this target, they could also look at the different measures. For example, when I talk about regulatory measures, we talk about policies and law implementation. And when we look at the non-regulatory measures, we need to look at the voluntary mechanisms, standards, and certification. Next slide, please. In terms of indicators and what could be helpful here to further build a target and work on their metrics and databases, we have a list of potential indicators that could be useful here. Let me just name a few of them, and the rest of the indicators are actually contained in the notes section of this presentation that we understand could be accessible online later on, so you can see the whole list. But for example, we can look at the change in number of species threatened by international trade, or we can also focus on change in number of countries that implement the CBD voluntary guidance on sustainable wild meat sector that were welcomed in the CBD COP in Egypt. In addition, we have a number of different initiatives implemented by partners that would be helpful here. For example, Traffic's wildlife trade portal or CITES trade databases. Next one, please. Let me come to the next target, which is target 8. And here we have also a number of observations and suggestions. First of all, we noted that there is some overlaps between target 4 and target 8 because both of these targets are related to sustainable use and management of wildlife. We also thought that targets and the monitoring elements, they're too focused on fisheries as currently formulated in the updated monitoring framework. And we think that the more comprehensive inclusion of all wild species is necessary be considered here. When we look at benefits, we also thought that the concept of benefits would need further clarification, including looking at different categories of benefits, for example, economic, social, cultural, or looking at ecosystem resilience and others. When it comes to suggested monitoring elements, at the moment we found that there are uses related to animals for food and medicine, but I think it's important that other uses should be included, for example, related to fashion or lifestyle or as pets. And finally, we also think that this target would benefit from looking at them and also adding the concept of equitable sharing of benefits to all users, including indigenous peoples and local communities. Next one, please. When it comes to initiatives which could be relevant for these targets, and some of the initiatives also, they're very relevant for target 4, let me name just a few of them. So first of all, there is a very important initiative which is called Wild Harvest Initiative, which is an example of a data set that's being used to assess social, conservation, and economic benefits of recreational wild animal harvest in Canada and the United States. We also have a multi-partner initiative, which is called Sustainable Wildlife Management Program, being implemented by FAO, CIFOR, CIRAD, and WCS. The program work along the wild meat value chain for conservation and sustainable use of wildlife resources. We also have one of our partner sites developed livelihoods case studies that demonstrate how sustainable and legal trade can support the conservation of wildlife, as well as improve the livelihoods of local communities. A number of others, for example, the Communities in Illegal Wildlife Trade learning platform designed by IED and IUCN Suli Group, as well as a very important initiative of traffic, which is called Fair Wild Initiative. Next one. We also looked at other targets, which are target 13, 14, and 15. And the partnership thought that it's very important to include the recognition of legal and sustainable trade as an element contributing to halting the biodiversity loss. For example, if we look at target 13, the CPW thought that wild species in use and trade, they should be recognized as a part of wider biodiversity, and the impact on them should be really reflected in various elements, for example, in planning, in national accounts, or in environmental impact assessments. When we look at target 14, we also know that many supply chains include wild sourced species and products, and we think there is scope for reforming economic sector toward sustainable practices along the supply chain for wildlife trade. And concerning the target 15, it seems important to include the contribution of wild species to sustainable and responsible consumption practices, as well as to look at the demand reduction for illegally traded wildlife products. Next slide, please. As was already pointed by the previous speakers, target 3, it's a very also important and very relevant target for sustainable use and trade in wildlife. And we, in this particular target, we wish to share some observation related to human wildlife conflicts. First of all, when we look at the reduction of conflict and we see the percentage number, we think that it's quite a tricky exercise to really set the realistic percentage, because the reduction of the conflict could be understood in a very different ways. For example, are we looking at reducing crop and livestock losses, or we reducing retaliation towards species, or we actually reducing actual killing of a species because of conflict? And we think that this term, reduction of conflict, we need to further clarify what it means in order to set the realistic number. Secondly, in relation to the monitoring elements, this can be further expanded, and they can look at species and conservation areas. For example, we can look, where do most conflict occur, or how many species are being threatened by the conflict. We can also look at the people and communities, for example, look how many people directly affected by the conflict, as well as addressing economic impacts and look at capacity and knowledge and policy aspects. For example, to what extent do countries have detailed management plans and strategies? And finally, here we have a list of suggested indicators that you can see on the slide that could be helpful to further elaborate in this target. And in terms of initiatives, one of our partners, IUCN, they've been working on global assessment on human-wildlife conflict, which is currently in preparation. And this assessment can further contribute to the elaboration of the metrics and the target. Additionally, we also have one of other partners from CITES. They have a MIC project sites, and we can extract some data to determine monitoring trends, which could be useful also for conflict. Next one, please. And in conclusion, and finally, I think it's important also to highlight some aspects related to health, given the situation we have been experiencing over the past months. CPW has developed a joint statement that proposed 4 guiding principles that you can see on the slide. So these principles aim to reduce the risk of future pandemics originated from wild animals. So I'm not going to read them, but you can see on the slide. What we thought is important here is that one of the most important outcomes of COVID-19 might be the opportunity to look at to strengthen the policy, including through the post-2020 global biodiversity framework, to address the relationship between biodiversity and human health through multi-sectoral collaboration. And as a final point, the CPW, so we're all 14 partners, we ready to contribute our collective knowledge and expertise to the wide range of wildlife-related topics to further guide the development of the framework. And of course, we also have partners attending this webinar, and we'll be happy to answer the questions or regarding the presentation or any other questions you might have. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Christina, for this insightful perspective on wildlife management and some of the current challenges we face actually in the different processes. For me, it came into my mind that there is a lot of knowledge and a lot of, it's a very broad spectrum of challenges, processes, and it is a good overview that we get with this presentation. At the end of the workshop, we should then ask ourselves, what does this mean for the global biodiversity framework? So this is the second step that we should probably also try to find answers in. How can we reflect this meaningful in the framework, which is a framework? That means it is something very strategic, very high flying, and it invites all partners, also those that are working together with Christina in this partnership, how to implement then the global biodiversity framework, to break it down to their area of competence and where they can enhance the protection of biodiversity in their specific field and in their specific area of knowledge and competence. Now, we have got some questions, and I would like to thank all those who played the game, as I said, and raised questions with a queue at the beginning. And I would like first to start those addressing the presentation given by Kim. So one question is, how can you kind of abandon the minimization of unsustainable impact and completely shift to this management? So we have seen that Freddie Fulfi was a little bit puzzled that you kind of wanted to not give up, but to reduce the attention we should give to the minimization of unsustainable use and more focus on management. I guess that has also to do with your specific role in FAO. FAO is always focusing and has to focus, that's their mandate, on food production. But the more I listen to all your chats and the presentation, the more it gets clear to me that we should try to build bridges and try to understand that we don't live in our ivory castle, but we have to live in the real world and try to balance interests. And so there might be still need for conservation in a strict way, but maybe it is also very important to shift as a general statement, as a general policy, to shift our production and consumption much more towards sustainability. So maybe, Kim, could you just explain a little bit why you would minimize the sustainable use or the protection part of it?
So we probably can't go back to the slide, but the minimization was actually increased in size. It wasn't a case of getting rid of it. And it's really not a case of dismissing the use of highly protected areas. They're very, very, very welcome in the mix of tools we have. They're just not an endpoint. We're not looking for more protected areas. We're looking for healthier, more productive communities and natural systems. So it's more of a rebalancing I'm talking about, Norbert. And I think when we look across the rhetoric that's used in how we're trying to capture benefit for people and nature, I think we really need to sell these much more difficult stories to tell than just moving people aside. These difficult stories that maybe countries that are struggling will be able to implement. So nibbling away at rectifying practices, minimizing poor practice within the overall practice of use so that it moves it up the continuum towards sustainable use. How do we broaden the conversation? So in the meetings that I had across people who are involved with biodiversity, the CBD's framework is seen as part of their business. And this is Basil mentioned in one of his, he said, do we need a sectoral system view of the global biodiversity framework before we get to the COP? Well, I would welcome them all in, because when we held under the Committee of Fisheries process, a meeting to talk about the post-2020 framework, we had over 1,000 people registered and 500 people turning up. This community is ready to be engaged, but they have to be engaged as a friend and not a foe. So what I'm saying to you here is, no, we don't want to get rid of avoidance strategies, but we have to make sure that where the bulk of production is actually happening, and those political decisions are much harder about moving people out the way, is working with those people to allow them to do better. Thanks.
Thank you, and I can continue with the next question that's also, I guess, addressing you. That's the role of IPLCs and how to integrate their knowledge in management plans. As I understand it right now, it is quite a scientific and economy-based management in many ways that is dominating, I would say, the world, and a little bit marginalizing the knowledge that IPLCs could offer for us. Can you elaborate a little bit how FAO and maybe even outside of FAO we can also integrate it? And I can also then ask Christina to come back and give also some elements to this question, because she was also mentioning some initiatives where the knowledge of IPLCs was taken into account. Tim?
Yes, sure. I think if you're interested in this topic, moving straight on to the small-scale fisheries guidelines that were negotiated amongst the members was a direct response to this challenge that you speak about. And this challenge is something that is literally haunting all of us. How do we put together with delegations of government a framework which allows a broad uptake and a broad feeling of welcome right down to the ground level? So if we're going to be putting in indicators, are those indicators at all available to those types of communities at the smaller scale, so we get that bottom-up approach? And I think that's why, in a way, part of my way of thinking has changed. We need more support mechanisms for this framework. and less dictatorial levels of exactly what people must do. And we have to let those thematic support levels, be they within the CBD Secretariat or be they within agencies that are specialized, to bring people around the campfire of the post-2020 global framework to talk about what's working, what isn't, try to nudge them into a place of following the lead, but not necessarily putting such hurdles in front of them that they feel, well, I can't do that, so that's not my framework. And we have a webinar taped of a number of small-scale fisheries leadership people into this process, which is available under the virtual dialogue, COFI virtual dialogue post-2020 framework. I'll share the link in the chat.
Thank you, Kim. Christina, you want to complement?
Yeah. Thanks, Norbert and Kim. There is one initiative, and I think we have, I would like to invite one of the partners. We have the relevant indigenous people, local communities. I think the program that we have called Sustainable Wildlife Management Program. May I invite Robert Nazi from C4 or Sander Artersen from FAO to complement regarding the PLCs?
Maybe if they're not ready now, we can come back to them later on. And I would like to, because we have time restraints, maybe focus on the next question. And that's one that has to do with mainstreaming. And several people, Gaute, Jorge, they were asking how can biodiversity, together with probably agriculture and other sectors, make sure that biodiversity, food production, is taken into account in other economic sectors. Sometimes I think that agriculture and biodiversity should be brothers in arms. They have this common interest. But if it comes to industrial development, if it comes to mining, if it comes to industrial fishing, there are some threats and economic interests that make it very difficult for the biodiversity world to make sure that biodiversity is integrated in the policies and the planning of their sectors. So maybe, Kim, you could, from your side, and then also Christina, try to see if we can kind of bring everything together and support each other in order to have a bigger impact on other sectors. Because this is the challenge. We have seen it in the last two COPs. We had mainstreaming as a topic. How many ministers wanted to be there and wanted to give some good messages that they would like to integrate. So that's a constant challenge. Then I would continue with the second question also that Ezekiel was asking on. He would like to have a checklist. That would be very helpful, because what I also see is that our discussion is very, very broad and very scientific and intelligent, but how to formulate a message that ministers can understand and that colleagues like I, who are lawyers, we can apply it in our daily business in defining our national biodiversity policy and how to implement the global biodiversity framework. Could we kind of develop do's and don'ts for sustainable use? That would be my second question. So shall we start with Christina? You didn't say much the last time, so can you maybe start with your answer on these two questions?
Yes, thank you. And I can also see some of their questions in the chat. I think one point is from also perspective of the partnership when we were preparing the presentation. I think it's very important to look, and first of all, to define the different terms, because I can see the terms wildlife is popping up, and then the terms of sustainable use versus use, and then what we mean by luxury or lifestyle. So I think it's important that the post-2020 framework is really set up a really clear definition, because in different countries we might have a very different understanding what we mean by wildlife use or subsistence use or different any other aspects. And for example, when we look at the target 4, we have use, we have harvest, and we have trade. So what's the differences between use and harvest, and how use and trade? I think these terms, it's very important to really identify them in the framework, because it will be really helpful for countries later on to understand how exactly different aspects of wildlife can be measured. So let me answer this question in this way. I think without the right terminology, it's a very tricky to set up and actually develop the right indicators and metrics. And especially, as was mentioned by Dilis in her presentation before, sustainability is very hard to measure. So,
Kim, I challenged you.
Yes, please. I would like to come back on that. Just 2 quick points. During the virtual dialogue, we held a poll, and in this poll, we asked the fisheries and aquaculture community whether they thought they were very closely aligned to the Aichi framework and the Post-2020 framework, or whether they were aligned and connected. And people said, yes, we're very aligned, but we're not well connected. And this is one of our problems, and it speaks to your point too, where you say we have to be able to talk to people in a language they understand. Well, potentially, I'm arguing that good thematic support and keeping people in the conversation is more important than defining the perfect indicator, which is, you know, we can go around in circles. Equally, when we set these themes, don't be too prescriptive. Give them broad umbrellas. Underneath these, we can have targets that people might be able to hone in on. But whether we're talking about interconnected, healthy, shallow water systems, or, you know, green environments, let's bring people in and start a community where these types of conversations are seen as normal conversations in a banking context, in a business context, and so on. Something that can capture people's imaginations. And we sat in Rome, and everyone tried to load up sentences with intricacies which were perfectly correct scientifically, but closed off the conversation to the general audience. Thank you.
Thank you, Kim, and I fear we have to move on. But you put a lot. You put the challenge. You gave the challenge on to the co-chairs. They have now to draft a first draft that is in a simple wording that everybody can connect with and participate in the implementation of it. And I'm 100% with you. As working in a ministry, I also think that we need also both. We also need kind of political will. It's important that people who are on the ground and their everyday business is linked to it. But often I have the impression that there is a kind of competition in the cabinets on budget and who is more important. And therefore, we hope that the summit that is coming up, unfortunately, will be a virtual one. But this can also lift on the political agenda biodiversity, because we need really the support from, or at least the understanding from other sectors and other ministries that we also they have their role to play and to share that. With this, we can conclude session 2. And as I said before, there are coming in more and more questions, and the debate is going on. I'm really pleased to see how active that this workshop is. Still, we have a schedule more or less to respect, and I would therefore thank again the 2 presentators and invite them also, if they have time, to answer questions in the chat, if they still have time and can come back. Otherwise, we will take the questions on for the forum, for the online forum. Now we continue with the next session, and I can hand over to my co-lead, Mphatso. Mphatso, please.
Okay, we'll go directly into the next session, where we'll look at the concept of sustainable use through the customary sustainable use, and also look at the private sector and see how we can incorporate these two within the framework. I know that the previous session, we are getting more discussions and a lot of debate in the chat session regarding the terms of use, whether it's trade, whether it's harvest, whether it's use, and what the differences are. And also, I think the previous speakers have helped to unbundle the concept of sustainable use. So I'm sure that as we move forward, maybe from the previous comment, we'll be able to find how in different settings, what is the language that is being used in terms of defining what sustainable use is. And so I'll go straight into Ms. Yoji Carino's presentation, who is the Senior Policy Advisor at the Forest People's Program, who also show us the angle of customary sustainable use. And I hope we can reflect how then we can get this in the framework. So Ms. Hoji, this is your floor. The floor is for you now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. The first, next slide, please. Customary sustainable use is an element of two cross-cutting issues of the CBD, Article 8J, in situ conservation, and Article 10 on sustainable use. And if we look at the text of these two articles, it also, in fact, also includes benefit sharing from the use of traditional knowledge and associated with resources. Therefore, customary sustainable use is in fact relevant to all the three objectives of the CBD. Next slide, please. So in many parts of the world today, there are widespread examples and everyday experiences of people living in harmony with nature. So this is not actually an endpoint, it is a relationship. So in fact, nothing comes closer to the practice of living in harmony with nature as customary sustainable use, embodying historical and intergenerational human interactions with nature. So for example, this includes agroforestry management, including shifting and rotational farming in Asia and the tropical forest regions, marine and coastal management in archipelagos and islands, including revitalization of mangroves and coral reefs, and pastoralism in dry lands and reindeer herding in Northern Europe and Russia. So I think this customary sustainable use has so far been under-recognized, undervalued, and underreported within the CBD. And this will be a missed opportunity unless it is given due attention. Next slide, please. It is well established through community participatory research, but also by the recent IPBES global assessment, that the territories, lands, and waters of IPLCs are biodiversity hotspots. They harbor much of the world's remaining biodiversity, but are also facing enormous pressures from large-scale extractive industries, agriculture, and infrastructure development. So shown in this slide are examples of communities documenting case studies on customary sustainable use in Guyana, Suriname, Thailand, the Sundarbans. And there are also many cases which have been compiled and analyzed in local biodiversity outlooks, which presents the perspectives of IPLCs on progress on the implementation of the Strategic Plan for Biodiversity 2011 to 2020. Local biodiversity outlooks will be launched in September 2020 as a complement to global biodiversity outlooks. Next slide, please. For indigenous peoples and local communities, and I dare say for all of humanity, the continuity and health of customary sustainable use within our so-called territories of life will strongly determine success or failure of the 20 vision of living in harmony with nature and the 2030 milestone targets. Portrayed in the slide is a community map of cultural land uses in northern Thailand, a rich mosaic of nature and culture interactions. In these communities, due to the good state of nature arising from revitalizing rotational agriculture, there is a countervailing trend, for example, on pollinators, against the general trend of pollinators decline. But because of community beekeeping activities and support for biodiversity, pollinators are actually in the increase. But these are threatened by expansion of protected areas, prevention of customary rotational farming, and propagation of commercial high-input agriculture in surrounding areas. Next slide, please. So the parties of the CBD at COP12 approved a plan of action on customary sustainable use, which has three main components: incorporating customary sustainable use in NBSAPs, promoting and strengthening community-based initiatives that support Article 10C, and identifying best practices through case studies, mechanisms, legislation, and other appropriate initiatives. However, sadly, one conclusion from local biodiversity outlooks is that Aichi Biodiversity Target 18, which is focusing on mainstreaming customary sustainable use and traditional knowledge, has not been met. And why is this? Next slide, please. For me, the greatest challenge for the post-2020 global biodiversity framework is internalizing a profound holism in our outlooks and in our approach to overcome false divisions and dualisms working against systemic change. So, for example, overcoming the separation of nature and culture and promoting the interlinkages between biological and cultural diversity. Between the analytical precision of science, which sometimes divides things up, and the holism of traditional knowledge. Working within the reality of integrated social ecological systems, and the indivisibility of the economy, ecosystems, and human health. And even the unity of ecosystems, species, and genes with the human social systems. And implementing all of this within the these social elements, within the substantive elements of the global biodiversity framework. Because we're at a very strategic moment where we have one universal agenda, but we have to accommodate diverse ways of knowing and doing and not be directed and not be prescribed by very strong, sometimes top-down planning. Next slide, please. Yeah. So what are the pathways towards living in harmony with nature? If you see in this slide, we see that customary sustainable use is completely embedded within the CBD objectives and the post-2020 framework, as well as the Sustainable Development Agenda. Not leaving indigenous peoples, local communities, women, and youth behind requires putting society and people at the center of the post-2020 biodiversity strategy. The UN Universal Principles of Human Rights must inform and guide the post-2020 framework, addressing the systemic problems of impoverishment and social inequalities at the root of the biodiversity crisis. Meaning we have to embed equitable decision-making about rights to lands, resources, and knowledge in the various goals and targets. Targets 19 and 20 are cross-cutting themes which should not be standalone elements in the strategy, but embedded in the substantive targets. Next slide, please. So if we use customized sustainable use as a lens to embed IPLCs in the post-2020 global biodiversity agenda, we will come at our agenda with a much stronger holism or stronger integration. So currently, how does the global framework address the underlying sustainable issues and inequalities of impacts and benefits arising from frameworks and future decisions? Are the collective actions and rights of indigenous peoples in conservation, sustainable use, and benefit sharing supported and protected against interests and powers of, for example, vested interests or the larger industries? And how will we apply this criteria to the proposed targets of the post-2020 framework? So I'll just look at maybe a few targets. Next slide, please. The next slide shows the delineation of a protected area in Thailand cutting across the village boundaries. So target 1, which addresses spatial planning of lands and seas relevant for conservation, currently does not address securing indigenous people's land tenure, which is very relevant to this target, but has not been included. What is considered natural in most cases are IPLC lands with low human impacts, and the impacts are low precisely because of the relational values they have with nature. So an additional component under this target would be IPLC territories, lands, and waters as a distinct land use category, not just protected areas or OECMs. What are seemingly natural critical ecosystems can in fact be indigenous territories, and we must not repeat conflicts from the past over protected areas. And there is now a SDG indicator 1.4.2 on securing land tenure for women, communities, etc. Next slide, please. On target 4, which is about ensuring the harvesting, trade, and use of wildlife species that is legal, sustainable, and safe, this should include taking into account respecting customized sustainable use of IPLCs. Because in the past, a lot of what is considered illegal has been very discriminatory. So subsistence use has been criminalized, whereas uses by external actors has been promoted and has been given incentives. But there are many unwritten customary rules that actually protect against overexploitation in customary sustainable use systems and customary systems. Next slide, please. If we go to target 8, which focuses benefits for the most vulnerable groups arising from sustainable management of wild species, flora, and fauna, the contents are actually very close to describing customary sustainable use, because the benefits are should also be shared with the most vulnerable. And however, this target could be strengthened by adding the component of customary sustainable use of wild species of flora and fauna by IPLCs. And this can be monitored through community-based monitoring and information systems, through qualitative ground truthing and case studies. And this can complement the more quantitative global and national indicators. Finally, to close, conscious of the time, next slide, please. We have a problem that there are very few indicators for customary sustainable use and traditional knowledge presently in the monitoring framework and in the table of indicators that has been presented for Substa 24, right? To identify the four indicators that have already been adopted by the parties on traditional knowledge and sustainable use, there's a process, a technical process over 2 years to define those indicators, and yet they're not fully operationalized. I think we will require a similar process in between COP15 and COP16 once the global framework is more set, so that indigenous peoples, parties, and other scientists and institutions can come again in a technical process in order to address some of the missing indicators in our current framework. That's my presentation on the customer sustainable use. Thank you very much for inviting me to make this presentation.
Okay, thank you so much, Georgie, for the presentation on customary sustainable use and how it is relevant for all the three objectives of the convention. This information that you have shared from the studies and the reports, I'm sure has helped most of the participants today to understand the status quo and also the proposals on how customary sustainable use can be used as a lens to include IPLCs in the global biodiversity framework. Also has helped us to see how that can be integrated there. So now I would like to go to our next presenter, who is Ms. Paxi Pia Lewis, who is the director of the Namibian Association of Community-Based Natural Resources Management Support Organizations, to give the next presentation. So please, Max, you have the floor.
Good afternoon for us in Southern Africa. Thank you so much for the organizers for allowing us to be part of this important forum. My name is Maxi Luis, and I work for a network of NGOs that support a program in Namibia, but it's also a program that is very well known in Southern Africa, called the Community-Based Natural Resource Program. Sorry.
Could you please unmute yourself? I think you are on mute.
It's just not working.
We can hear you now.
Can you hear me now? Okay. Thank you so much. My name is, and I'm from Namibia. I was asked to share some experience in terms of a program that is implemented in Southern Africa called the Community-Based Natural Resource Program, but very much looking at the Southern African context. We work on this program in partnership in Namibia, for instance, with our government and our communities. Next slide, please. Now, as part of my presentation, I will just be concentrating on what is CBNRM for us in Southern Africa, the enabling environments, which is the legal framework, but also looking at CBNRM and sustainable use in our context, and looking at the issue that has been very much discussed and commented on, which is benefits of sustainable use, also looking at it from a community-based natural resource program point of view. Next, please. Now, just to get started, I just want to quickly make a couple of comments, is that for us that live in the southern tip of Southern Africa, but I also think in Africa as a whole, many rural Namibians, many rural communities live together, for instance, in our cases in Southern Africa with nature, particularly with wildlife resources. So in order for us to offset a lot of the losses, for instance, that comes from wildlife and from other resources. For instance, also when I have to also touch on predation of wildlife, and lions, for instance, in our case is a huge problem. Communities need to receive benefits in return. And these largely come from tourism, unfortunately, and hunting also form part of that. But through the mechanism of this community-based natural resource program, we have conserved a lot of the natural resources and making sure that our future generations, that this program will provide quite a significant returns for that investment and benefits to those communities. Now, from a policy context for CBNRM and looking at CBD, we think that a lot of the legal frameworks are very much protected by the Convention on Biological Diversity. But we also particularly are very happy to see that targets 4, 8, 15, and 20 are especially relevant towards the issue of sustainable use and community-based natural resource management. Next slide, please. And so just to explain what we mean by community-based natural resource management in our context, first of all, I just want to emphasize that it is a global strategy that enhances conservation outcomes. And in our case, living on this part of the tip of Africa, it affects issues around climate change. And I like what Georgie was saying, and this is very important. It's a complementary land use. It's important that communities have a choice and make a choice in terms of the land uses that will actually address their needs. But an example that I can give you from where I come from, for instance, from a natural resource point of view, wildlife is a driver of economic growth. There could be other drivers in other parts of the world, and they can use that as part of natural resources as a driver. But I think it has been emphasized as part of previous presentations that equitable resource use is a key to make sure that these habitats are actually protected. Now, what does that mean? Why are we so keen on using this program for our communities? It empowers communities. It improves livelihoods in those communities, especially when you look at all those resources that has been mentioned before. It involves management, and it has to be very adaptive when you look at these management systems. The legal framework for me is important. The communities need to have that enabling environment for them to participate. It has to be sustainable. And then it also has to be an issue that the communities have to be accountable. There has to be issues of respect. It doesn't matter whether it's the communities, government, or the private sector. And it has to be very transparent. I also need to emphasize community-based natural resource management and the voices that you are getting from communities is that they want to be equal partners in every investment that you see in their natural resources. So they want to be seen to be shareholders and not just being seen as users that are being not recognized. Next, please. Now, why is sustainable use important? I think it has been mentioned that it really contributes to viable rural economies in many places, including the work that I do with communities. It contributes to development, food security, health, and maintaining cultural traditions. It also provides food, full fiber, and everything that has been mentioned before. Income and jobs, especially in rural areas, are very important. Where I come from, there's not much in semi-arid areas for communities to rely on, not much of agriculture. So when there is job opportunities within issues around sustainable use, it actually goes a long way. It also improves physical, psychological, and spiritual well-being. It empowers local communities with rights to access, manage, and benefit from biodiversity. Next. Just to continue, we also found that it has incentivized a lot of species and habitat conservation. If you look at it from an environmental point of view, protects lands for biodiversity. We have found that with sustainable use, that where there has been wildlife and there is a sustainable use, that large pieces of land have been protected from a biodiversity point of view. The most important is that it offsets cost of living alongside with dangerous, for instance, animals, for where I come from. But we also need to take note that it can also be hampered by the following issues. Human-wildlife conflict, especially conflict between people and wildlife, especially if it results in death and infrastructure damage, crops and livestock and so forth. That can also hamper a lot of issues in terms of, progress when it comes to sustainable use. The biggest one for us in Africa is the issue of weak tenure. If there's weak tenure, it's a big, big problem. Poor recognition or enforcement of local rights, which I think it's something that is lacking in most of the world, not just in Africa. If they don't have those rights, it makes it extremely difficult for them to manage their own resources. Then the issue of unequal distribution of costs and benefits from wildlife, and then a powerful external interest that seek to undermine local people's rights. So the whole issue of social justice comes forward within sustainable use, and I think it's an issue whether that needs to be addressed as part of sustainable use. Next. Slide, please. This is just a slide that I wanted to show how, from my experience in Namibia, by giving rights to communities, had actually make sure that we protect a habitat, and that is making sure that there is three-legged, I call it the three-legged pot, which is one is the economic values that needs to be first enhanced, making sure that CBOs or community organizations are strengthened. If you do that, actually you create tolerance, for instance, in areas where there's human-wildlife conflict, people become much more tolerant. It addresses issues of human-wildlife conflict because they are in charge and they know that they can offset a lot of the losses they have. But it also reduces indiscriminate killing of wildlife also, or just overuse of resources, and it reduces poaching. That's some of the experiences that we have. At the same time, it addresses issues around social benefits, making sure that there is a distribution and of benefits and making sure those benefits actually translate to the communities on the ground. At the same time, it addresses issues around capacity building and empowerment, which leads to the overall habitat protection. So it's something that I think has worked, and where I come from in Namibia. And so it's something that we have tried to share experiences in Southern Africa and other countries to replicate. Next. Next slide, please. Yeah. So just a couple of key points. I think I talked about the issue of social justice, but also that leads to protecting local people's rights to sustainable use. Will also protect biodiversity and appropriate incentives that to manage biodiversity sustainably. And I think I have heard across all the presentations, the issue of use and access, very critical. The issue of alienation and also sale. But the issue of benefits, I want to emphasize, because nobody would like to conserve if you don't benefit. There are also the other important rights that one sometimes overlook, and that is the issue of personal community security, and then self-determination of that particular community. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, I just wanted to say that community conservation is at the heart of Southern African economy, and the future and the developmental plans of the future of our continent, and it should be really taken into account that we need to empower and give those rights to communities so that we look at a good habitat that is being protected, an environment that is protected by the communities themselves. So I think this is where my presentation ends, and I would like to just say that I have a couple of my colleagues on the platform. If there's questions, they can also be helpful in reacting to the questions. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you so much, Maxi, for highlighting the intersection between sustainable use and conservation, but also the importance of sustainable use for livelihoods. And thanks for also highlighting that communities are equal partners in sustainable use and how the three-legged perspective on benefits applies in our discussion on sustainable use. So thank you so much. Now I would like to introduce our last panelist for this segment, who is Ms. Valerie Normand. She is the senior expert on ABS at the Union for Ethical Biotrade. Please, Valerie, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much. I hope you can hear me and see me. Okay, so thank you very much. So on behalf of the Union for Ethical Biotrade, I wish to thank the CBD Secretariat for this opportunity to share with you lessons learned by UEBT, its members and partners over the past decade in supporting the implementation of the CBD objectives. So of course, also of sustainable use. And this is as a contribution to the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Before I go into lessons learned, I would like to say a few words about the Union for Ethical Biotrade for those of you who may not be familiar with UEBT. So UEBT is a nonprofit association that promotes ethical sourcing of ingredients from biodiversity. It supports and verifies the commitments of companies in sectors such as food, cosmetics, natural pharmaceuticals, to sourcing with respect for people and biodiversity. UEBT members commit to gradually implement practices defined in the UEBT standards. Next slide, please. And next slide. And next slide again. So just to mention that this is quite a long presentation. Given the time constraints, I will not go into every slide in detail, but it can be used as further reference for participants who may be interested in further details. So now the UEBT Ethical Biotrade Standard. So the Biotrade Standard is really at the core of UEBT's work. It is based, as you can see, on 7 principles, 3 of which are directly related to the CBD objective, so of course including sustainable use. And the standard is organized in principles, criteria, and indicators. For further information on the UEBT standard, you can go to the UEBT website, of course. And just to mention that it has just recently been revised following a multi-stakeholder consultation. Next slide, please. So essentially, companies working with UEBT include farms, cooperatives, processing companies, product manufacturers, and brands in sectors such as food, cosmetics, and natural pharmaceuticals. So as you see, they are all along the supply chain. Next slide, please. These companies use a multitude, yet small volumes of different ingredients from biodiversity, particularly plant parts or compounds, but also microorganisms and algae, which come from cultivation and wild collection around the world. Next slide, please. Some numbers to illustrate the impacts to date. So UEBT has over 58 members globally, who source ingredients in 68 countries. Members are improving their sourcing practices in over 700 supply chains, and 273 ingredients from biodiversity have been verified or certified against the UEBT standard. I will go over the next slide very briefly. So next slide, please. Just to give you an idea of who UEBT members are across the supply chain. So these are some of the UEBT members. Next slide, please. We also provide advisory services to other companies, which are on this slide. Next slide, please. And we work, of course, also with a number of partners in supporting sustainable supply chains. Next slide. Thank you. So now really getting more into the subject of this presentation. So next slide, please. So basically, as a contribution to the post-2020 global biodiversity framework, UEBT has decided to share lessons learned over the past 10 years from its work with companies in supporting the implementation of the CBD objectives at the ground level. So there are 10 lessons, each drawn from specific experiences in the work of UEBT and its collaboration with companies. And each of these lessons are illustrated by practical examples, many of which relate to sustainable use. Unfortunately, due to time constraints, I won't have time to go into these practical examples, but they are all included in this document available in August. So I will go over these 10 lessons briefly with you, and I invite you to consult the document once it's available for further information. Next slide, please. So as I said, we drew these lessons from the work carried out with our member companies and partners. Next slide, please. And now coming to what are these 10 lessons learned. So first of all, the first lesson is biodiversity is our business. So what does that mean? So essentially, companies increasingly recognize the extent to which their products and operations depend on conserving and sustainably using biodiversity. They understand that there is a business case for conservation and sustainable use, for example, to ensure the availability of biodiversity for product inputs or the ability to access biodiversity for research and innovation, and also to reduce costs and risks associated with lack of good practices. Next slide, please. The second lesson is that biodiversity is a consumer expectation. Since 2009, UEBT annually measures consumer awareness of biodiversity and how this affects purchasing decisions. Over the last decade, consumer awareness of biodiversity has expanded. A major learning is that as consumers increase their awareness of biodiversity and its importance, they have lower confidence that companies are taking steps to protect biodiversity. So there is an opportunity for companies to recognize this rising awareness and to use it as an opportunity to meet expectations from consumers. Next slide, please. The third lesson is about biodiversity, which means engaging on the ground. So although increasing international attention to the loss of biodiversity has led business to engage, a significant gap remains between company commitments and their implementation on the ground. And UEBT members are required to take concrete action on the ground. Next slide, please. Lesson 4. Independent standards, such as the UEBT standard, can provide guidance on good social and environmental practices for ingredients, products, or sectors. They are tools to distinguish companies, ingredients, and products that follow good practices from those who don't, including practices, of course, related to sustainable use. In our experience, UEBT verification and certification often pushes existing commitments into implementation or drives new commitments in ethical sourcing. Next slide, please. So lesson number 5, people and biodiversity are inherently linked. Companies can contribute to local economic development through ethical sourcing practices in a number of ways. And one important lesson is that by contributing to local development, companies also help communities respect biodiversity. And I think this is something that has come out in other presentations this morning. And there are, of course, examples for each of these lessons on how this can relate to sustainable use. Now, the next slide, please, for lesson number 6. And this lesson number 6 relates to the third objective of the convention, which is about, as you know, the fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising from the use of genetic resources. With respect to this third objective, UEBT assists companies in respecting national ABS rules while developing products in a manner that respects people and biodiversity and contributes to conservation and sustainable use. So companies working with UEBT are already exercising due diligence and collaborating on ABS with governments and communities. And we have seen a number of positive examples demonstrating that ABS can indeed contribute to conservation and sustainable use. Next slide, please. So one important lesson that we have gathered is that ownership of biodiversity actions must lie at the senior management level in order to be effective. Commitment to conserve and sustainably use must be integrated across company strategies, operations, and supply chains. And benefits for companies include more effective supply management, for example, and corporate reputation. Benefits for suppliers include improved working conditions, recognition from the purchasing company who are looking for suppliers who respect, of course, the CBD objectives and sustainable use practices. Now, moving to the next lesson, lesson 8, in the next slide. Thank you. So when defining actions to maintain or enhance biodiversity in specific areas, it is critical to consider local circumstances, and I think this is also something that has come out earlier this morning, existing pressures in sourcing areas, and ongoing conservation efforts. Good actions for biodiversity are fine-tuned to local realities, involve producers, and complement existing local strategies. Now, going to lesson 9 in the next slide, please. Biodiversity regeneration is the next step. Companies are beginning to think not only of reducing harm or conserving endangered or threatened species, but also about regenerating biodiversity. And this can take, of course, as you know, many different forms, including incorporating beneficial insects, building up the soil, or planting native trees to prevent soil erosion, for example. And finally, the last lesson, which relates to working in partnership. And working in partnership, of course, can happen at different levels across the supply chain. So, for instance, partnerships between suppliers and farmers in the supply chain are key, but also collaboration with national governments where resources are accessed, where ingredients are sourced, working also with researchers and universities to ensure the sustainable use of biodiversity in sourcing areas. Also, one important point from this lesson is that companies should strengthen local collaboration and empower local suppliers who have often a better understanding of local realities, of course. So this covers the 10 lessons learned. And now on this last slide, if you can please go to the next slide, just to point out that in this Big Shift document that you will have the opportunity to consult in more detail, there is also a section which links the elements of, or the targets rather, and goals in the zero draft of the post-2020 framework, with some of the principles included in the ethical biotrade standard. And if you look at these in more detail, you will see that they are very practical and quite comprehensive in their application on the ground. So I just wanted to mention this. And so this is the end of the presentation. If you have any questions, of course, I'm happy to answer questions now, but you can also find quite a lot of information on the UEBT website. And also the Big Shift document, which contains these lessons learned, as well as a number of useful examples related to sustainable use, will be made available shortly during the course of the month of August on the UEBT website. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Valerie. It is very pleasing to note that among other lessons, consumer awareness of biodiversity is growing, and that this provides an opportunity for the private sector to take concrete action on the ground. These lessons will be very useful in our further consideration of the post-2020 global framework and the role that the private sector can play in its implementation. So I'll straight away move into the questions. Because of time, I'll just give each presenter one question. So I'll start with the question that has just come up to Valerie in regards to the presentation you have made. So the question is asking, how do we scale up biotrade lessons to provide guidelines to enterprises and companies from other productive sectors that are not focused on bioprospection? So these are sectors in mining, infrastructure, trade, and industry. How can we scale up these lessons that you have just presented so that they can also be able to catalyze the action that we need for the global biodiversity framework? So this is for you, Valerie, if you can respond on that question.
Yes, I'm sorry, Martha. I'm not sure I fully understand the question. I think I see it now coming up on my screen. It relates to whether voluntary standards and actions by companies are sufficient. Is that correct? Or if there's a need for stronger regulation in relation to industrial extractive industries. So I cannot respond in terms of industrial extractive industries. Certainly what we have found is that these standards are very helpful to assist companies in improving their practices. And we work hand in hand with companies, and it's really an engagement for continuous improvement over the years. So there are minimum requirements to respect in order to become a UEBT members. And then members engage, as I said, for continuous improvement. And there are principles set out, as you've seen, but also criteria and indicators to follow these developments. And also a number of tools that can help companies to improve over time, such as, for instance, developing biodiversity action plans, which can be implemented on a step-by-step basis. So I hope this helps answer the question.
Yeah, thank you so much for indicating that there are a number of tools that can be adapted to the other sectors. So I think this is one way that we could look at the tools and see how the other productive sectors could adapt to the changes. Then I'll go to the next question that is going to Georgie. The question is, what do you do if the ecosystem can handle the combined pressures, including customary use and Is it always true that customary use is always sustainable? This one is going to Georgie. Can you please respond to that question? Georgie, please. Thank you.
Of course, we're not making a general statement that all, but actually the definition of customary sustainable use is that it's sustainable according to traditional practices and respecting biodiversity. So the very definition of customary sustainable use does not cover all customary use, but it is certainly producing better conservation outcomes. Therefore, the other question which relates to how can you accommodate both? If we develop some criteria for sustainability, the natural system accommodate customary sustainable use more than large-scale extractives, for example. So when we're talking about sustainable use, we're talking about an entire spectrum of use. Some on one scale are very unsustainable and others which are more sustainable, right? And in the CBD global framework, we definitely have to protect and support the sustainable practices. And actually, in some cases, really prevent and protect them from harm. So each country, of course, and together with their society, will have to negotiate this. But one thing that we learned from the past is that customary sustainable use has been undervalued because the focus of national development planning has been on the large sectors, right? The industrial sectors. And even if you look at the current strategic plan on 2011-2020, if you look at the sustainable use targets, they try to green what is currently economic but unsustainable, rather than actually supporting what is already green and supporting to make this economic. So I think those choices need to be a discussion within society. It has to be informed, and it also requires strong political will from governments to support their citizens when they are the ones who are requiring support for livelihoods, conservation, and other benefits. Thank you.
Thank you for that response. The next question is going to Maxi. The question is, how were the processes when you are working with the local communities? How do they react when you want to include issues of accountability and transparency in their processes? So this is a question for Maxi, please.
Maxi, we can't hear you. You're muted.
I'm trying to unmute myself and it's not working.
Now we can hear you.
We can hear you. Go ahead, please.
That we develop systems that addresses issues around governance, but also all the natural resources and the livelihoods aspects. So we have many systems that we have rolled out from the beginning of the program, from the rural areas up to the levels of decision making, which is government, also including non-governmental organizations. So communities are well aware when it comes to governance that they need to have their meetings, their annual meetings, to be able to be accountable to their members, and then it actually go up the ladder in terms of, have to report back. I mean, it's not a process that it's not an easy process. It's not 100% perfect, but at least we managed to get that buy-in. And that buy-in comes in when they get the ownership. When they have the ownership, they know that they have to be accountable to their peers, but government also has set up many systems that we have to monitor in terms of making sure that they are accountable to themselves, but also accountable to the country, because these are national resources that they have to be accountable to. So we have different mechanisms and systems and M&E systems that are in place at all levels to make sure that they are accountable.
Thank you so much for clarifying on that issue, Maxi. Because we still have some, there is another question that is going to Valerie with regards to the presentation that you have made. The question is, what are the main drivers of your members' changes in business practices? Is it consumer pressure or regulatory push or something else, or a combination thereof? I think you can answer this question together with the next, which is asking, what are the main incentives for companies to engage with sustainable use of biodiversity? So Valerie, if you can address those two questions. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you. I think you should hear me now. Yes, so what are incentives? Well, this is what I think is part of the lessons learned, is that, of course, it is the incentive to be good world citizens, but also what comes out is that it certainly makes economic sense to businesses to respect CBD objectives, realizing that it is in their interest in the long term to conserve biodiversity and sustainably use it, given that they rely on these resources. So consumer pressure, as we saw, is growing and is rising. So there is an opportunity for companies to address that consumer pressure and to really make changes at the ground level. And so this is what is needed. And of course, regulations are useful, standards are useful, probably a combination of approaches will be useful in further pushing companies more generally to mainstream biodiversity in their activities.
Okay, thank you so much, Valerie, for those responses. And our next question is going to Georgie. The question is saying, could you please speak a little more about low human impact in IPLC territories? Because it seems the impact is significant and often enhances biodiversity. So is the term low human impact being used to refer to adverse human impact? So this one is going to Georgie. Could you please address it? Thank you.
Yes, thanks so much for that question. Currently, even in the current framework, there are use of wilderness, natural areas, or low impact areas. Within the world today, there are very few remaining natural areas that are actually not already that hasn't been interacted with humans over history, and especially more recently. Therefore, in calling, for example, further conservation in so-called seemingly natural areas, what are being called natural now is in an index of human impact. They're saying these are areas with low human impact. But in fact, some of these areas have very strong human management by, for example, indigenous peoples. Of course, these are also vast areas, but because of the cultural relations with nature, is sometimes called relational values, the impact of the human activity is low because we are trying to achieve a balance in the relationship, as well as trying to make sure that this continues for future generations. So, for example, there are many cultural laws and taboos or practices that say, take only what you need, or make sure that the resource continues to regenerate. So, in fact, we're a little bit afraid that the current framework will start reinforcing divisions between humans and nature, rather than stressing relational values and good balance in human-nature relationships. And sometimes maybe calling this wilderness areas or natural areas when they are in fact areas where there is a good interaction between humans and nature might not be the best way to describe these areas for conservation.
Thank you very much, Georgie, for that response regarding the human and nature relationships. Perhaps we could take the last question, considering we only have Maxi, you can respond quickly in a minute. It's going for Maxi with regards to trophy hunting. Can this be said to be sustainable over the long term when northern governments are being pressed by citizens to ban imports? So this is for Maxi, if you can quickly respond, maybe in a minute.
Okay, I think it's a very loaded question to do it within 2 minutes. I will say yes, if it's being implemented sustainably, and we have done so, and over the couple of years on the southern landscape, it can be done. We have to improve it, yes. We need to have other alternatives, but we have been using it as a conservation tool, and it has been working for us. A colonial relic, I think it, yes, I agree, but I also disagree that the voices has to come from those ones that will term it to be a trait that they feel comfortable with. We feel comfortable to trade with trophy hunting because I think it works for us. And that decision comes from us. It's not, if it's being pressured from outside, that's what makes it unsustainable. I mean, yeah, I can have more discussion around this. I think it's a bit unfair to do it within 2 minutes.
Yeah, thank you, Max. I encourage you to continue responding to this issue in the chat, and also to the other presenters who just finished presenting. Please continue engaging in the chat so that you can be able to address some of the questions that I might not have been able to read because of the limited time. We were supposed to go into a 5-minute break, but looking at the time limitations, I would rather we go straight into the next segment, and we can look at the final presentations by the co-chairs. So I think we'll go straight into the third segment, and I'll hand over to Norbert, who will coordinate this session. And thank you so much for your participation. Please continue to engage in the chat and address the questions to those specific people that you want to address the questions to, and we'll keep engaging. So Norbert, over to you for the third session.
Thank you very much, Mphatso. Excellent job that you have done. And to all of us, we had a very lively discussion with good questions and also good answers by the experts. I hope that the co-chairs don't need the 5 minutes break, and they are ready to step in and to give us their perspective when it comes to the future process, in particular with regard to sustainable use. But of course, this is part of the overall process. And I know that you have prepared a presentation that explains to all the participants here how you see the process going ahead. Who is taking the floor? Francis, Basil, floor is yours.
Thank you. If I can be made a presenter, I can share my screen and show the presentation.
Basil, you can share your presentation now. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you see it now? Okay. All right, Francis, over to you.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending where you are. I don't yet see the screen. Okay, there we go now. I can see it. So we are going to share this presentation with my co-chair. I'll present some slides, then we'll continue with some others towards the end. But just to say that for us as co-chairs, the outcome of this consultation is going to be very, very important for us as we draft the next version of the framework. So we would like to encourage you to participate effectively, because as you've heard, we've had to change the method of consultation on this. We could have had face-to-face, but as explained earlier, it is now not possible. But all the same, this gives us opportunity to really hear from you and see how we can incorporate those useful ideas coming through. So let's go to the next one. So how are we going to approach this presentation? We are going to be looking at lines. Our next steps to zoom in the issue of sustainable use within the post-2020 framework. And this, of course, stems from the fact that during the consultation,
Francis, you're frozen more or less. We only hear bits of your comments. So we try once again, and otherwise I might ask Basil to step in if we cannot improve the line. Francis, I'm sorry, but we cannot hear you. Your image is frozen. Now, turned off your video, but it's still not really working.
Yeah, can you hear me? Although me, I hear you guys very well, so I don't know what. Okay, let Basil continue if I'm not in any way audible.
Now it's okay. So maybe if you switch off the video, then it's okay. But we would have to start again because it was from the beginning that we could not really.
Okay. Thanks. So Basil, I'm audible enough.
I think you can. We heard you on the presentation plan point 1, so you can start from point 2.
Okay. So continue with this slide. I was just saying that with the presentation plan, you're going to hear us say something about the context of the post-2020, the timelines that we have. And that is provisional, most of them, given the current situation. Then the next steps as we work on this framework, the organization of work, and you will see that clearly. Then the post-2020 framework itself, we are going to be zooming in on sustainable use. And I said earlier that we've had a lot during the consultations and even during the working group meeting that the framework should look at the 3 objectives of the convention in a balanced manner. And so today we are on one of them, that is on sustainable use. Then the key messages from the thematic consultations that actually is relevant to sustainable use. And then the post-2020 key messages. And then from there, our co-chairs' advice and expectation. So that is the presentation plan. Let's go to the next. I hope I'm audible.
Yes, now it's okay.
Yeah, so you've heard a lot about this, not to go again in detail about it, but you'll see from there that when the decision 1434 was adopted, there were those overarching guiding principles, 13 of them. And you can see the first one, they are dealing with the participatory approach. So we as co-chairs, these 13, we did not take them just as a listing, but we've tried our best to make sure that we work along them. And so this process itself, one that we are doing here is to make sure that the process is really as participatory as possible. And of course, we are talking about being inclusive, gender responsiveness, transformative, comprehensive, catalytic, visible, knowledge-based, transparent, efficient, results-oriented, iterative, and flexible. So those guiding principles are clearly thought out very well by parties, and I think it has really been very instrumental for us in carrying out the work. And you've heard, of course, that this is a framework that we are saying is for everyone, is for all. Not very easy to draft such a framework because you are talking about a framework that will touch on productive sectors, governments, civil society, business, banks, farmers, teachers, IPLCs, you know, all consumers, everybody has to be on board. And when you are developing such a framework, you will see that it's not as easy, but it is also challenging enough for us really to do a good job towards that, because biodiversity is for everyone on this planet. If you are still living on this planet, it is because biodiversity is there to support you. So that's why the framework really becomes a framework for all. And I'll then request the co-chair to go to the next slide. Now, in terms of the next steps, and this is the timeline that was adjusted after, of course, we could not hold the meetings of SABSTA and SBI that were planned for May. So we had to really keep thinking, consulting the Secretariat, consulting the Bureau, consulting SABSTA chair, SBI chair. Really, these dates are not in many ways. Some of them now, of course, we are seeing them being implemented, but others are still tentative, I would say. So we have, since coming back from Rome in February, not sat down as co-chairs, together with the team from the Secretariat, the SBI chair, SABSTA chair. We have tried our best to keep working up to this very moment. In fact, I must say this has been the busiest time of preparing this framework. We do not know if this pandemic was not as well, because the Zoom consultations or online consultations have been really, really enormous this time around. So we have got right now documents that are up for peer review, and the deadline has been extended up to August 15. You could have seen that in your email. So those documents which are there includes a table of the 2050 goals, together with the milestones, the action targets, the 2030 targets, the monitoring elements, the indicators, baseline data availability, then the annotations, as well as the SDG linkages to the framework. So you will see that, which is under review. But of course now, as you can see, we've started the thematic consultation on sustainable use, which I have to say is one of the fortunate one now to be taking place. We have been thinking most of the time about this timing, and sometimes it takes, again, time to have it confirmed. After that, then, once we've had the peer review, we should be able, as co-chairs, working together with colleagues I've already stated earlier, to really come up with a document that should go up for SABSTA. And this is the one that will have the SABSTA document itself is going to have the annotations, the SDG linkages. But of course, we had very strongly that we have to really get some ideas on numerical values on those targets. And this is something we expect to come from SABSTA meeting. After that, we should be able to draft the goals, milestones, and targets, including sections E to H, by the way, we have made progress there. And between that time, then, we should be able to have this document ready at least 6 weeks before the meeting of SABSTA. But also coming up are still other webinars. We expect in September to be launching the GBO5. We could be having another consultation, webinar consultation on a review mechanism, resource mobilization, and then also on synergies Again, you've heard the importance of this when I'm talking about working with other MEAs. A framework for all will mean we should not leave some of those MEAs behind. Then the thematic consultation on ADS. And from then, we could have this document presented at SAPSTA. That is tentatively planned for November. And following SAPSTA will be SBI 3. From that meeting of SAPSTA, then we should be able to develop a draft 1.0 that we are going to take to the third meeting of the working group. Again, the dates are yet to be confirmed, but sometime next year now. And our intention again is to make this document 6 weeks available prior to those meetings. And after the third meeting of the working group, we should then develop the final draft, which is going to be taken up at COP. Now, this COP was somehow slated for May, but we are monitoring the situation and seeing whether those dates will be realistic. So the next slide, please. So this one just to try to tell you of how the discussion happening now is going to be very relevant for the other processes. You will see that definitely what is going to come from here will feed into the report of SAPSTA 24th meeting, and therefore we expect that even from what we get here, like I said earlier, after the SAPSTA meeting, that it will eventually end up in the third meeting of the working group, where the negotiations will take place. So this consultation is not in isolation of the process itself. It is part of the other processes that is ongoing. Next slide. So in terms of the thematic consultation on sustainable use, what is mainly for us as co-chairs, what do we see as the key goals or targets that we want? We are saying that at the end of it all, we would like to have concrete advice and recommendations to be considered by the third meeting of the working group, as I said earlier already. So this text just emphasizes what much earlier, that the work from co-chairs, we see it feeding into that meeting. Its version of the framework itself. And as I said, this process also links to other timelines, but more then the roles of the co-leads. We couldn't be doing all the chairing from the openness to these kind of meetings. It will be too much for people to really participate. So we see that this is going on very well. And so they were nominated to do organization of the work, facilitating the process, and then preparing the work like this one. It involves some element of work. Then, of course, to do some bit of consultations, and then to assist us possibly up to the end of the process, because we wouldn't think that they will only do this meeting and then after that they are not visible anymore. They will be with us up to the very end. That's our anticipation. The next slide. So I talked already about this in the other slide, which shows the timelines. What we are saying here about coordinating with other MEAs is that we would like to see coherence and effectiveness. So we should explore opportunities for joint planning and reporting with other UNEP instruments, climate change, FAO, chemicals, and so forth, but avoid duplications. And yet, we have to ensure that synergies are captured. Duplication, even at national level, is a concern. And so we need to really make sure that the little resources that are available are not so much spent on duplicating work, but rather building on synergies. And then the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, as we said earlier, is a framework for all. So implementation will be by the relevant instruments that are existing and those that might still be negotiated or are upcoming. Next slide. So most of you have seen this. This is our theory of change. We modify it slightly. But if you look at it, now zooming onto the sustainable use in respect of the post-2020, you will see that the long-term vision is there, the 2050 vision of living in harmony with the nature. But really, to reach there, I think sustainable use, with the co-chairs, we think sustainable use is going to be very, very important if you are going to reach there. And therefore, you see that the 2050 goals do cover about 3 elements, but one of those is on sustainable use. The other being on conservation of species, ecosystem, and so forth, benefit sharing. But sustainable use now happens to be one of the goals that we want to achieve by 2050. Go to your left, you'll see that we have got those 3 key areas. You have got tools and solutions, you have got reducing threats, meeting needs of people. Now, if we do all that, you'll find that those elements of the targets that deal with the reducing threats, meeting people's needs, tools and solutions, really have got inbuilt in them the issue on sustainable use. So if you move from the left to right, you'll find that if you have appropriate tools and solutions, reducing threats, needs of people, then you could end up with promoting sustainable use, and therefore you meet human needs in a sustainable way. And then we aim, of course, to live in harmony with nature. But my co-chair will unpack that shortly. Let's go to the next one. Next slide, please. Yes, so this is going to be my last, then my co-chair will come in. From the meetings we had, the last one, the second meeting of the working group, we were advised, of course, to work and to merge some of what we had come up with as being goal A, goal B, as well as goal C and D. So this time round, we only have 4 goals. And you will see that goal A now covers ecosystem, species, and genetics. Those tended to have been a little bit like goals on their own in the first 0 draft, but now they are merged and they form part of one goal. Then the other one is on the contribution of nature to people. Benefits are shared fairly and equitably, and then the means of implementation. The plan is as good, but if it is not implemented, then it just remains just like that as a plan. Now, just for you to look at briefly on some of those targets that relates to sustainable use. In fact, we've only tried to highlight some of them there, but my co-chair will cover more in the next slide. If you look at target 4, it is where we are trying to look at really making sure that harvest, the trade, and use of species is sustainable. So we are looking at tackling the unsustainable harvesting this time around in post-2020. But again, conservation, species recovery, some of them still relate to sustainable use as well. And I saw very good comments coming in about invasive species. I would think they are between sustainable use and invasive species, especially if it is the invasive species that is now being used sustainable. I thought that was some very good thought coming through. Then tools and solutions, again, you'll see that if we mainstream at policy level, at planning, at laws, we mainstream in production and supply chains, sustainable consumption, responsible choices. Those targets will help us again to drive towards sustainable use. And of course, meeting the needs of people, where we have had already people talking about benefit sharing as being one of the ways of promoting sustainable use. So I just needed to touch on a few of those. We can take your questions if you have some. Co-chair, over to you.
Thank you. I hope people can hear me. Let's move to this slide where we're going to take up a lot of the conversation that happened on the chat about what's the relationship between the various targets. And if you look at the top of the screen, we're trying to explain how target 4 are relating to target 8 and 9. And they're kind of two sides of the same coin. One side is the target 4, which is about making sure that whatever the activity is, it is sustainable. And the other side is to make sure it is meeting people's needs. and they're supported by a number of targets. And you have talked about many of those through the chat. So I just want to highlight the target 13, which is really about the mainstreaming, and target 15, which is linking to the choice people make and consumptions and supply chain. So really, this is about how into the two. We're totally cognizant of the fact that you may be commenting on many other targets, but we're suggesting that those are maybe the main one you wanna talk to. Some message about the other consultation, and we've tried to highlight some that are coming from others. They're not a complete set. Definitively, when we talked about area-based conservation measures, there was a lot of points made about sustainable use in terms of land and seascape approaches, and that has come out through the chat over the last few hours. The definition service is also something that is important, connectivity and the social dimension. And I was very encouraged by some of the comments I heard from IPBES about the needs to have multidisciplinary approach and not just relying on biodiversity is very important for sustainable use. Another point coming from the ocean consultation, and Kim Friedman was there, and we had some really good conversation there. And the complexity, the number of actors, and then the need between the balance, the conservation and the use. So that's what I was trying to explain earlier. One point I would leave for the marine community is I know they've been working very hard for many years to make progress. And I think one of the questions we're all asking ourselves is, how much of the approach of the past has been successful and should be retained, and what change is needed in terms of making things better or different. Community engagement is paramount, also amply illustrated through the chat. If local communities are not engaged in part of the discussion, it's not going to be a very successful proposition. Other thematic, transparent implementation, knowledge, traditional knowledge and customary sustainable use should be an important consultation. Access and benefit sharing, you can imagine there was lots of very important points, only retained 2 here. We could have added a lot more in there. Benefit sharing should be reflected in sustainable use as well. Now, as a conclusion, what are Francis and I advice and expectation? Once again, give us concrete advice. I know that there is lots of discussion to be had, but let's try to give us as concrete advice as possible that we can reflect in draft 1. So that would be very useful. Then be innovative at the same time. Don't feel bound by the goals and targets. If you feel there is something dramatically important that needs to be added, we're going to listen to you, and we're looking for that. Links to the other part of the framework. So definitely, this is very hard to put a boundary in terms of scope around that sustainable use, or for that matter, any thematic. So we realize that there will be links to other. Balancing the scope and then scoping your discussion. So the balance between sustainable use and others. It is easy to go very broad on sustainable use. So it is easy to talk about every target. We hope that providing you from some advice on focus would be useful. Remember, this is an expert discussion. There is no need to reach consensus. If there is divergence, be it, identify the point and the rationale, and leave the negotiation to the open-ended working group. So this completes our presentation. Thank you very much for the time. It has been a great morning for us, and I'm looking forward to the Q&A. Thank you.
Thanks to the co-chair for this presentation. I know the process is a complex one. We had also some questions on the structure and the different processes, how they at the end fit together. I know that the co-chairs have a very structured mind, and they this is helpful, I guess, to bring all these work streams at the end somehow together, that it fits in. And whenever I see a presentation of you, you focus on charts, and that makes me believe that you understand, and that's important, I think, and it's not so easy, how the whole process should go ahead. And I think everybody is happy with the co-chairs, how they help us to advance in the process. On the other hand, you don't only help us, but we also should help you. So we should give you advice, as you just mentioned. We have got a few questions, but we are still open for more. One is exactly addressing the fact that there are many processes sometimes in parallel. So we have now the peer review that you mentioned. The deadline has been prolonged until the 15th of August. And at the same time, we heard that we will have a questionnaire within this sustainable use work stream or working group process. So what would be your advice? Where should now the specialists for sustainable use give their inputs? More in the monitoring framework or more in this questionnaire?
I'll start, and Francis, as usual, will provide a better guidance. We are totally aware, and actually we felt that this work of the sustainable use would be helpful for the sub-step process. So I suspect that the sustainable use experts that are looking into this consultation will probably provide the same kind of advice in both process, just putting a little bit more details in the one on the sustainable use thematic. So I would say I suspect there is not two times the work, but just a little bit more on one side. Francis?
Hello. Thank you, Basil, for that. I meant you where you maybe need to, but I think you said it well. Now, with respect to whether we need to be focusing more on the monitoring framework or on the questions coming that is needed for this consultation, I think perhaps we could see how to do both. Because once the window is closed or the time frame is closed for the peer review, and we miss out any elements that could have come that is relevant for sustainable use, then it could be, there could be a lag there when we are now, reviewing and working on the next version of those elements of the framework. So perhaps we could see how we utilize the time available for both.
Thank you to the co-chairs for their shared answer. We have a second question that deals with incentives. How can we increase incentives to make sure that the action, how was it formulated, that sustainable use is incentivized? So do you see is in the financial area, or do you see it more in the policy area or trade? What is your clue how we can have better incentives to aim for sustainable use?
So this is a good illustration on how all the targets are contributing to each other. If you look at the tools and solution, you will see target 17, which is around incentive and subsidies, that is supporting all the reducing threats and meeting people needs targets. So definitively, we've kept the incentive and subsidies targets separate from resource mobilization exactly for that, because we recognize there is incentive that are directly linked to certain aspect of sustainable use. So definitively, we're fully aware of the work that is being done on various incentive. One that I've known a little bit, and Kim is probably a lot more able to talk, is the work being done on subsidies for fuel for long distance fishing fleets. So those are those are important work that help us get to our goal. Thank you.
Yeah, hello. In addition to what Basil has just said, I think incentive, we also maybe have to look at how it is being interpreted at a particular time. Sometimes maybe other people may look at it as benefits. We've just heard from, I think, a presentation from Namibia, where there is that element of people benefiting. You know, they tend to do something much better in terms of ensuring sustainable use. So yes, incentives where people see benefits accruing, where people clearly see that you know, their situation is improving, that is likely to really, you know, give people more momentum to promote sustainable use. So question of incentive is very important, but addressing it also, in some cases, it could be a case by case depending on the situation, maybe at national level. In some places, maybe policies might be enough, financial issues might be enough, whereas some people might just want to have some direct benefits from the resources. So it could take all sorts of you know, intervention. But as the co-chair says, again, the targets tend to really complement each other so well to drive us towards these incentives. Thank you.
I would like to conclude with the two remaining questions that I have on my list. One is talking about the relation between the connectivity and the sustainable use. It's difficult for me to really understand what Dave Pritchard wanted to know when he asked Basil to explain what he means by connectivity being better suited than to targets on sustainable use. So maybe you can evolve on this a little bit, Basil. And then the last question that I would like to ask you is how to engage the private sector in the sustainable use discussion, and also in sustainable practices that be more and more a part of business models and also calculation of prices. And so therefore it is probably also important to address directly the private sector in enhancing the sustainable use. So Basil, please.
So I'll take the question 4 first about the role of the private sector. Definitely, if we're building one of the issue we've seen with the previous framework is really people were turning to the CBD focal points as the only resource to implement. So what we're trying to build is a framework that is engaging everyone. And I think we've heard it from many presentations and from many comments. We're going to be successful if everybody's engaged, and that includes the private sector. I've seen many very progressive private sector organizations, including in the agri-food business, and I think we're going to need to learn and look at what has been done in other parts of our system. If you look at the way the private sector is engaged on the climate change side, can that be replicated, extended to address nature issues? Those are questions we're going to be asking the open-ended working group and working through with the SBI. On the question on Dave Pritchard about connectivity and sustainable use, I'm having some challenge and maybe about my poor command of the English language. But definitely looking forward to probably more bilateral discussion to answer that one. Francis, over to you.
Yeah, just a quick one on the business involvement of the private sector. Just to add a little here that first, I think the private sector in many parts of the world, there is so much business that is based on biodiversity, really, when you look at it. So I think demonstrating to the private sector that sustainable use is actually good for their business and is good for their business in the long term would be one way of getting them on board. So clearly they could see maybe that biodiversity loss could have on their business. We've seen now just what COVID has already brought to most businesses. You know, one aspect only happens, and the private sector that, for example, was or depends on tourism. I'll give an example in Uganda here, where tourism right now is more or less on a on a standstill because of an outbreak of something, the pandemic. But consider it the other way around. If there was some other outbreak somewhere there that biodiversity loss happened, and if, say, a private sector had invested heavily on, say, gorilla tourism or on any other tourism activities, and those animals have got challenges of remaining alive, that would mean the private sector would be so much in danger of losing millions and millions of business. So I think the private sector really has a lot to benefit from sustainable use of biodiversity. So therefore, they have also, in many ways, that responsibility to have some business models or having the action plans within their operations that actually reflect or take into account sustainable use going forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much to the co-chairs. There are still other important messages in the chats. One is with regard of the transformative change, and another is with regard to the questions or of the indicators. We heard today that IPLCs also have something to say in this regard. I guess that now we have this monitoring framework where we discuss about indicators, and this is certainly the first moment where we should voice our knowledge and our expectations when it comes to indicator. But the discussion will go on, and we will also have the problem that the indicator list probably is much too long at the end to be manageable, because at the end, as we said before, it has not only to be an easy language so that politicians and the broader audience can understand what's the global biodiversity framework, but we also have to make sure that it is not too complex when it comes to monitoring and to the question of what indicator, how do we measure our progress, and therefore we also always have to be bear in mind the co-chairs are very brave, resisting all temptations to go over the number 20 when it comes to targets, and this is also something that I think from the beginning many delegations and many NGOs were asking to have a framework that is manageable, that has a limited number of targets, even if it is not perfect, possible to implement it. And this brings me to the kind of concluding remarks. I will start and then ask Mphatso if she would like to add from her side also what are the takeaways for her. For me, the discussion clearly showed that it is a cross-cutting issue. So many areas are directly linked. Threats are directly linked with the sustainable use. And therefore, it is not an easy topic to tackle and to get. And hopefully, as I said before, as easy as it can be, as understandable as it can be. What for me was the second important element is that we learn more and more that we cannot afford to just focus on one side of the coin. Or if we take the sustainable development, it's a coin with three sides or a kind of dice. We have to bring together the economy, the social aspects, and the environment. As I understand it right now, and this comes to the incentives, right now, the international business models are still in a way that you can produce and you can have a better price if you don't pay the costs that the production will have on nature. That's the unsustainable general part of it, and to tackle this will be necessary if we want to have this transformative change. Then we will really have to make sure that it is not a sales argument to produce cheaply by not covering the costs that the production is giving to nature. But this is a sensitive and a politically very, very difficult topic, I guess. And therefore, I also understand that sustainable use, if we see it in this broad way that goes also in the transformative change and in the other economic sectors, then it is one of the most challenging topics, but also of the most important to really trigger this transformative change. We had another lesson is the manual of do's and don'ts that Ezekiel was asking for. And this stands for me as, again, a little bit in what we have to do is to come up at the end with something that is manageable, that is understandable, and that gives guidance that is clear, and that is also formulated in a way that we can compare, that we can learn from each other. And that brings me also to this need that we have to have a more structured reporting so that we understand, okay, Malawi is doing this and this works very well, so why don't I do the same in my country? So that we can really together commonly learn and better progress and our high ambitions that we hopefully will adopt in Kunming. It is our goal, and this is the ongoing process, to give the co-chairs, as they asked us to do, to give them a clear advice what is now in the current draft, what is missing, what is maybe not perfectly drafted, and what maybe also goes too far because it is not easy to implement. And that brings me also to the question that has been raised several times, that we need a clear definition. And I think that is more and more important, that when we want to speak the same language, we also need a kind of a glossary. We need a kind of really a part of the global biodiversity framework probably will be a glossary that defines, okay, this is sustainable use, these are the elements, these are the responsibility of the different MEAs. So not necessarily more, but we should have more guidance how to implement it. And this will be also a challenge ahead of us. So with this, I would ask Mphatso to complete and to give us her assessment of this afternoon. And it will not be the end, as we said. We will have now this possibility to answer to the questionnaire. It is not yet online. I guess it will be online in today or tomorrow. The idea was really to start with this workshop and this discussion, and then immediately the day after, treating the questions and answering the questions that are in this questionnaire. And then as a third step, we will have this online forum where we will can have the discussion, but it is already taking into account all the inputs that we got in the questionnaire. So it will be probably going more into detail, will be more concrete than the discussions that we had today, even if I think that today we have been already very concrete and not at all high flying, but we were tackling concrete challenges and actions to take. So this would be my takeaway, and Mphatso, please complete. And for me, it was a pleasure to serve as a co-lead, and I'm glad together with Mphatso to continue this process together with all of you and with all your knowledge. Thank you. Mphatso?
All right, thank you very much, Norbert. I think you have highlighted most important points. I would only like to thank again all our participants, our panelists, and the Secretariat for their support. I'm confident that we have at least managed to meet our objectives for the day, and the cross-cutting nature of sustainable use and the complexity regarding unbundling this thematic component. We see how this is a very important discussion, and we have a great challenge ahead of us as well as great opportunities. So I hope that with the contribution of everyone who is here today, we will address our challenges and make the best use of our opportunities. So we are counting on you for their continuous participation to have an output that will strengthen the global biodiversity framework. So please do not divorce us along the way. Otherwise, thank you so much for your participation, and goodbye, and may God watch over all of you so that we can meet again in the next processes. Thank you.
you all. Bye-bye.
So
Bye-bye.
let's meet again next time. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Everyone,
Thank you.
Nice to be with you guys.
stay actively engaged into the rest of the consultation.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.